Most adventurers enter a dungeon to kill its monsters, but Van Sirius is descending for a far stranger reason. The Dark Dragon Lord at the bottom is Ryuka, the childhood friend he has come to visit. 17-year-old Van fights toward the deepest floor with a single goal. Treasure and fame mean nothing to him. Every monster is merely stands between him and Ryuka. The battered guardians finally admit that Van has earned passage. He steps beyond them and enters the chamber where the dungeon's ruler has been waiting for him. Van reaches the deepest chamber and faces Ryuka in her colossal dark dragon form. She welcomes the challenger with overwhelming pressure, although their familiarity already makes this unlike any ordinary boss encounter. Ryuka raises her claws and offers Van a battle as his reward for reaching her. Van braces himself beneath her shadow, knowing the fearsome display is mostly part of her dramatic greeting. The supposed boss fight immediately collapses into banter. Ryuka complains that Van is drenched in sweat, and he asks her to cool him with a breeze after the exhausting descent. Van asks why Ryuka is still using her dragon form. Embarrassed, she admits that she wanted to surprise him after their long separation, then transforms back into the humanoid girl he remembers. Ryuka rushes forward in her human form, openly delighted to see Van again. The legendary dungeon boss greets him with the carefree warmth of a childhood friend rather than an enemy. Inside Ryuka's home, they share vegetables and drinks like an ordinary pair of friends. The absurd truth becomes clear. Van regularly crosses a deadly dungeon, simply to spend time with its final boss. Van admits that every visit leaves him guilty, because Ryuka's monsters attack him on principle. He only wants to see her, yet reaching her room requires beating her loyal guardians unconscious. Ryuka's injured monsters insist that stopping intruders is their duty, even when the intruder is their boss's closest friend. Their loyalty turns every friendly visit into another brutal dungeon run. When Van prepares to leave for errands, Ryuka immediately begs him to stay and play. His visits are rare, and she is unwilling to surrender even a little of their time together. Van reveals that he has moved to the city beside the dungeon, and plans to join the Adventurers Guild. Ryuka realizes he may now visit every day instead of once a month. Ryuka teases Van for moving closer because he missed her, and his weak denial only makes her more suspicious. Their argument exposes feelings neither childhood friend is ready to name. Van promises to return the next day, leaving Ryuka almost unable to contain her joy. Her entire dungeon can see that the two are already far more important to each other than they admit. Ryuka's monsters celebrate the news while preparing for Van's daily arrival. They know his visits will mean regular beatings, yet they still cheer for their boss and her hopelessly oblivious childhood friend. Ryuka gathers her commanders after 37 C-rank adventurers reach floors 7 and 8. The defenses are becoming predictable, so the dungeon staff begin discussing new traps and stronger resistance. Ryuka barely follows the meeting because she keeps watching the clock for Van. Her commanders immediately notice, and their teasing forces her to deny how eagerly she is waiting. Ryuka remembers the day a violent gust separated her from her family. With injured wings and no strength left to transform, the young dragon was stranded alone in the forest. Van found the exhausted dragon and stayed beside her. They played together every day, but Ryuka still cried at night, because she missed the family she could no longer reach. When Ryuka finally reunited with her family, young Van told her not to keep them waiting, and promised they would meet again. He was simply relieved that she was no longer alone. Ryuka kept Van's promise close to her heart, while Van trained until he was strong enough to cross her dungeon. Her underlings can only call the devotion between them painfully adorable. Ryuka loudly insists that she and Van are only childhood friends. Her denial loses its force when her enormous dragon head terrifies the very subordinates she is trying to convince. Another adventurer enters the enormous 100-floor dungeon in search of treasure and glory. Ryuka calmly tells her staff that they will know immediately when the intruder is Van. Floor after floor is cleared in barely 10 minutes, sending Ryuka's monsters scrambling to their stations. The impossible speed leaves no doubt that Van is racing toward the bottom again. Van reaches Ryuka far sooner than expected and greets her with an easy smile. His speed catches her off guard, but he apologizes as though crossing the dungeon were a minor delay. Ryuka reminds Van that he left her alone after yesterday's visit. She tries to sound annoyed, Yet her complaint only reveals how quickly she has grown attached to seeing him every day. Van and Ryuka settle into another relaxed visit, while the dungeon staff recover nearby. Their easy laughter makes the dangerous descent feel like nothing more than the price of meeting a friend. During a fantasy board game, both childhood friends boast about absurdly powerful parties. Van claims an elven princess, the world's strongest wizard, and Fenrir, while Ryuka counters with equally ridiculous companions and superior statistics. Even after years apart, Van and Ryuka fall back into the same wholesome rhythm they shared as children, turning a final boss chamber into their private game room. Their game becomes melodramatic when Ryuka complains that a wicked hero has seduced all her heroines. Van plays along, and the dungeon staff become far too invested in the imaginary romance. One companion suggests raising the heroine's affection until they become powerless to resist. The strategy turns an innocent game into another excuse to imagine Van and Ryuka as a couple. Ryuka's imagination runs so wild that she gets a nosebleed while staring at Van. When he asks what is wrong, she hurriedly claims she was only fantasizing about the game. Ryuka's underlings admit that they want to watch over the pair forever, although some are clearly motivated by their own indecent curiosity. Their support quickly becomes embarrassing meddling. One monster volunteers to hide in the corner and observe, only to be ordered to keep personal desires out of Ryuka's relationship. The dungeon staff are no longer pretending to be subtle. Happy grabs an instrument and launches into an ear-splitting love song meant to push Van and Ryuka together. Everyone nearby is forced to cover their ears before the performance can do real damage. Van lunges toward Happy and stops the awful singing before it grows worse. Ryuka watches in alarm as another of her underlings turns matchmaking into a full-scale disturbance. The others stare at Happy in disbelief, wondering what possessed her to sing after so many peaceful years. Even the dungeon's monsters find the performance too painful to endure. Someone explains that beautiful sirens enchant people with angelic voices, while harpies like Happy shatter eardrums instead. Happy's romantic plan fails completely before Ryuka catches everyone gathered together. Ryuka realizes her staff have been plotting around her love life and erupts in embarrassment. Happy and the other culprits are left scorched and terrified after pushing their boss too far. The group crowds around the game until Van and Ryuka are pressed awkwardly together. Ryuka panics at the sudden closeness, while the others treat her embarrassment as part of the entertainment. Their party reaches a horrible island crowded with goblins, and Happy is told to make the next move. Even their quiet afternoon becomes a competitive fantasy adventure. Ryuka lends Van the first 9 volumes of her favorite series, and confidently predicts that he will return begging for more. Van accepts the stack despite her overwhelming enthusiasm. After Van leaves with the books, Ryuka worries that she gave him too many and wonders whether he will actually read them. Her companions recognize that she simply wants to watch him enjoying something she loves. A dungeon trapmaster offers Ryuka a crystal ball that can show everything Van is doing. Ryuka refuses at first, insisting that secretly peering into his private life would be wrong. Ryuka sits alone before the enchanted monitor, unable to resist checking on Van. Her concern defeats her principles, and she quietly activates the device, despite knowing she is crossing a line. The monitor reveals Van reading the books and genuinely enjoying them. Ryuka beams at his reaction, while a companion mocks her for pretending that the surveillance was accidental. Ryuka leans closer to the screen and watches in absorbed silence. Seeing Van appreciate her recommendation leaves her far happier than she wants anyone else to notice. Ryuka's staff barges in and catches her staring at Van through the monitor. She hurriedly hides the screen and shouts at them to knock, making her secret obsession even more obvious. Ryuka admits that Van rarely talks about himself, so she watched him for 3 days and imagined every possible disaster, including a new girlfriend. Van was simply exhausted because he stayed up reading the books she gave him. Ryuka's companions ask what is troubling her after she loses sleep over Van. She insists that she is fine and calls them worrywarts, but nobody believes the strained denial. At the guild, Van mentions that his closest childhood friend is a girl. The other adventurers react as though such a relationship belongs only in fantasy, and immediately demand an introduction. The men crowd Van for details until someone drags them back and apologizes. Their fascination comes from miserable love lives, not genuine concern for the rookie adventurer. Back in the dungeon, Ryuka is told to stop spying and speak honestly with Van. She finally accepts that a direct conversation is safer than letting jealousy invent another catastrophe. Ryuka's hidden monitor nearly exposes her when Van suddenly senses that someone is watching him. The trapmaster boasts that the device should be undetectable, but Van's instincts are sharper than expected. Van stops in the street after feeling the same faint presence again. Years of training have sharpened his senses enough to notice even the tiny amount of magic carrying Ryuka's surveillance feed. Van returns and reassures Ryuka that he really did read the books. He tells her he would never have borrowed them if he planned to ignore them, leaving her mortified by how badly she misjudged him. Van joins a rookie party for a new dungeon expedition, unaware that the coming trial will test more than combat skill. Ryuka's bond with him is about to collide with a monster's charm magic. A puzzle seals the path forward, but Van bypasses it with overwhelming physical strength. His blunt solution sends the barrier crashing down before the party can finish studying the mechanism. On the cavernous 27th floor, another adventurer steps forward to demonstrate her own ability. She refuses to let Van solve every obstacle and prepares to show the party how it should be done. A struggling succubus approaches Van inside the dungeon and begs for his help. Her request quickly becomes suspicious when she moves close enough to drain life force from the unsuspecting rookie. The succubus presses herself against Van and activates her charm, expecting him to fall instantly. The rest of the party watches for his reaction, but her seductive attack fails to control him. Desperate to prove useful to Ryuka, the succubus tries harder to charm Van. When he remains unmoved, she lashes out and calls him friendless, exposing how badly the failed seduction has shaken her confidence. Ryuka's commanders secretly observe the encounter and debate whether another employee should learn about their boss's friendship with Van. Their discussion ends the instant they realize the succubus is actively trying to charm him. Ryuka's jealousy erupts as she condemns the succubus and declares that there is no room for a second heroine. Her staff barely has time to react before she charges into the confrontation. Van steps between Ryuka and the frightened succubus, stopping his childhood friend from attacking one of her own workers. Ryuka is stunned that he would protect the woman who just tried to steal his life force. The succubus admits that seduction is her greatest weakness. She has been fired from several dungeons because every attempt ends in failure, and even a young rookie like Van proved impossible to charm. Terrified of losing another job, the succubus drops all pride and begs Van to donate some life force so she can meet her quota. Ryuka's companions privately wish their boss could be half as direct. Ryuka refuses to tolerate the shameless request and declares that no second heroine will enter Van's life. Her possessiveness turns the rescue into another explosive argument. Ryuka swings with enough force to send the confrontation flying out of control. Van is caught in the chaos while the succubus's attempt to survive her job becomes a full dungeon brawl. Ryuka's senior monsters finally restore order and question the frightened employee. Van remains nearby as the dungeon staff decide whether failure at seduction truly deserves punishment. The commanders assure the succubus that Ryuka's dungeon does not fire workers simply for poor performance. She only needs to keep trying, and their unexpected kindness leaves her too emotional to understand the situation clearly. The succubus's gratitude turns into frantic nonsense about settling matters with Van. Ryuka cuts her off and demands a coherent explanation before the misunderstanding grows worse. At the guild, Van learns that monster materials and rare dungeon items can be exchanged for money. Dangerous exploration is unavoidable if he wants to become a full-fledged adventurer. Van asks Ryuka whether he may collect materials from her dungeon. She gives him complete freedom, turning his first serious treasure hunt into another private outing with his childhood friend. Van studies the guild's price list, where common slime mucus is nearly worthless, while minotaur horns and harpy feathers earn gold. Even with Ryuka's permission, he feels guilty profiting from her home. Ryuka leads Van toward a deserted area where they once played hide-and-seek. He worries that being seen beside an adventurer could damage her reputation, but she refuses to let gossip control their friendship. Ryuka's staff orders every available monster upstairs to repair damage on floor 27. The evacuation secretly clears the lower area so their boss can explore with Van without being disturbed. Ryuka brings Van into a vast treasure chamber and explains that her father built the dungeon and collected everything inside. Van finally understands why she always headed straight for this room as a child. From a hidden vantage point, Ryuka's commanders watch the pair wandering through the treasure room. Even hardened dungeon monsters find the childhood friend's private expedition unexpectedly charming. Deep in the treasure chamber, Van and Ryuka encounter a huge mana-born beast that normally appears only on the middle floors. Its presence this far below means something has disturbed the dungeon's natural order. The creature surges forward and the nearby monsters rush to contain it. Van draws his weapon as the treasure hunt abruptly becomes a real battle inside Ryuka's own home. Van cuts into the mana beast and proves stronger than the 4 dungeon guards fighting beside him. The overwhelmed monsters begin wondering whether Ryuka should hire her childhood friend instead of treating him as an intruder. After the earlier rescue, the succubus mistakenly believes the Minotaur has romantic feelings for her. She bows awkwardly while he stares, turning workplace gratitude into another ridiculous misunderstanding. The Minotaur receives permission to use an entire floor and a strategy board for a secret plan. Determined to impress the succubus, he begins preparing with the seriousness of a military commander. Van and Ryuka continue exploring the treasure room, and Ryuka excitedly points out a massive treasure ship. Van realizes she is enjoying the expedition even more than he is. Ryuka loses her footing and falls directly on top of Van. Their faces stop inches apart, leaving both childhood friends frozen while the hidden dungeon staff scream at the near kiss. After scrambling apart, Van notices a brilliant gleam among the treasure. The unmistakable luster reveals a piece of orichalcum, the legendary metal coveted by adventurers and craftsmen. Ryuka catches her staff spying on the private treasure hunt and glares them into silence. Their attempt to watch her progress with Van ends the moment she realizes they followed her. Van takes Ryuka into the nearby city for the first time. She drags her feet, only because every street, shop, and food stall is new to her, and her excitement keeps pulling her away from the route. A female adventurer recognizes Van and chats about crossing paths in a dungeon someday. Ryuka watches the friendly exchange closely, immediately alert to another woman showing interest in him. Back home, Ryuka asks Happy to explain the strange feeling that struck her in the city. She insists nothing is happening between her and Van, but the jealous reaction says otherwise. Happy reminds Ryuka that their fall in the treasure room almost ended in a kiss. Ryuka threatens everyone who witnessed it, while the staff continue teasing her about the missed opportunity. Happy bluntly claims Ryuka is frustrated because Van showed no lust after landing beneath her. Ryuka rejects the accusation and calls the harpy a bird brain, only encouraging more teasing. Ryuka's companions produce a collection of romance game events designed to raise Van's affection. They urge her to create secrets, accidents, and heated encounters until he can no longer ignore her. Ryuka tries to dismiss the absurd plan, then catches herself thinking about Van yet again. The realization that he is constantly on her mind leaves her more unsettled than any dungeon threat. The staff outline increasingly ridiculous romantic scenarios, including secret swapping and emotional confrontations. Ryuka is told that carefully staged support could force her relationship with Van onto a new route. Happy's imagination runs wild until Ryuka punishes her for picturing Van naked. Their argument is interrupted by an alert that an unknown party has cleared floor 45. Ryuka's staff celebrates the intruder's defeat of the floor guardian, but the victory carries a warning. The adventurers have now entered territory no previous party has survived. After killing the infernal ogre on floor 45, the arrogant adventurers understand why every A-rank party failed there. Instead of retreating, their leader declares that the Dark Dragon Lord will soon be theirs. The intruders are led by a legendary adventurer who has cleared dungeons across the world and once destroyed an entire pirate fleet. His companions believe no monster in Ryuka's domain can stop him. The party's confidence rests on their leader's overwhelming record. They insist that even the strongest living monster would have no chance once he reaches the final floor. Ryuka evacuates every non-combat monster and orders the remaining defenders into position. With the lower floors secured, the dungeon can do nothing but wait for the legendary party to advance. The commanders identify the intruders, a veteran warrior and a female mage who handles healing and long-range support. Their target is not treasure. They have entered specifically to kill Ryuka. Ryuka refuses to remain safely in her chamber and climbs toward the battlefield. Her staff warns that she is entering danger, but she insists on watching over the monsters defending her home. The veteran adventurer marches deeper with his mage close behind, completely unshaken by the dungeon's defenses. His calm approach shows that he expects the final boss to be another conquest. The warrior announces that he has come to vanquish the Dark Dragon Lord. Before he can advance, Ryuka's Minotaur Guardian transforms and blocks the corridor with his massive body. The Minotaur slams his weapon down with enough force to shatter the floor. The veteran absorbs the attack and counters immediately, turning the passage into a violent close-range duel. The Guardian's full swing leaves only a bruise on the adventurer. Even without healing or defensive support, the man's durability is far beyond anything the monsters expected. Steel and brute force collide again and again as the Minotaur refuses to yield. The veteran matches every strike, steadily driving Ryuka's Guardian backward through the damaged corridor. The adventurer grins as the battle finally gives him resistance. He increases his speed and pressure, forcing the Minotaur to defend against a barrage that barely leaves room to breathe. The veteran admits that endless victories left him hungry for a worthy opponent. Believing the Guardian can finally satisfy that hunger, he prepares to unleash the strength that made him famous. A devastating blow tears through the corridor and hurls the Minotaur away. The Guardian's enormous body crashes across the floor as the intruder continues toward Ryuka. The Minotaur struggles back up and charges again, refusing to let the adventurer reach his boss. His loyalty keeps him fighting even after the earlier impact nearly destroyed him. Their next collision breaks the dungeon itself, and the ceiling begins collapsing over everyone nearby. The mage loses her footing as stone and debris rain into the passage. Van bursts into the corridor and catches the falling mage before the rubble can crush her. His sudden rescue places him directly between Ryuka's defenders and the invading party. The dungeon monsters stare at Van, holding the beautiful mage, and immediately recognize the Pozo as a perfect heroic rescue. Their panic has less to do with the battle than with Ryuka seeing it. Ryuka arrives and finds Van cradling another woman in his arms. Jealous fury pours from her so violently that both allies and enemies freeze before she says a word. Ryuka transforms into her dragon form and fills the ruined corridor with killing pressure. The legendary adventurer finally stands before the Dark Dragon Lord he came to challenge. Van keeps the rescued mage safely in his arms while Ryuka glares at them. He cannot understand why his childhood friend is angrier about the rescue than the invasion threatening her dungeon. Van and the rescued mage communicate with quick hand gestures while Ryuka watches from nearby. Their effortless understanding only deepens her jealousy because they seem able to coordinate without speaking. The veteran adventurer lowers the tension long enough to offer Van a meat pie and introduce his mage, Sylvia. He treats the young swordsman as a potential ally, rather than another dungeon monster. When the battle resumes, the veteran orders Van to keep Sylvia safe while he engages the dungeon guardians. Van accepts responsibility for her, even though Ryuka is already furious about their closeness. Sylvia asks Van to try their coordinated movement once more. He follows her signal, and the pair prepare to support the veteran without getting caught in the collapsing battlefield. Van refuses to join the legendary party because someone important is waiting for him. He apologizes, but makes it clear that no offer can keep him from reaching Ryuka. The veteran tests Van with a sudden attack, expecting the rookie to retreat. Van draws his sword and meets the challenge head-on instead of leaving the fight to the older adventurer. Van intercepts the veteran's heavy strike and knocks the larger man backward. The legendary warrior finally realizes that the quiet rookie possesses strength comparable to a dungeon boss. Van openly declares that Ryuka is his childhood friend and takes her place as the veteran's opponent. Protecting her matters more to him than guild rank or the reputation of the man he faces. The veteran recognizes Van as a hidden threat tied to the Dark Dragon Lord. Van offers a simple condition. If he wins, the party must leave Ryuka's dungeon immediately. The two swordsmen vanish into a blur of speed as their weapons collide. Each exchange tears through the corridor, leaving the surrounding monsters unable to follow their movements. Van slips past another powerful swing and counters before the veteran can recover. His precise footwork turns the older man's strength against him and steadily controls the duel. The veteran launches a rapid series of attacks, but Van blocks and redirects every strike. Sylvia and the dungeon guards watch the legendary adventurer lose ground to an unknown rookie. Van ends the next exchange by catching the veteran's blade between his fingers. The impossible feat proves that the difference between them is far greater than anyone expected. With one decisive counter, Van hurls the veteran across the chamber and into the wall. The legendary adventurer crashes down, defeated before he can reach Ryuka. Shaken by the loss, the veteran asks how Van gained such power. Ryuka's staff explains that he has crossed this dungeon once a month for 10 years, growing stronger with every visit. The veteran then asks why Van pursued strength so relentlessly. Van answers that the reason should be obvious after everything he has endured to reach the deepest floor. Van points toward Ryuka and says he became strong enough to visit his childhood friend. His entire adventuring path began with the promise he made to the lost young dragon. Ryuka hears Van describe her as the reason behind his strength and turns bright red. His simple honesty hits harder than any confession her meddling staff tried to engineer. Unable to contain her embarrassment, Ryuka releases a burst of heat that sends everyone around her scrambling. Van remains confused while the dungeon staff recognize another emotional explosion. After the intruders retreat, Ryuka looks completely refreshed by Van's words. Her battered staff can only stare as their boss recovers from the crisis with suspiciously radiant happiness. The veteran is stunned to see every monster he fought already healed and grinning. Ryuka's dungeon restores its defenders so quickly that his hard-won victories have left no lasting damage. Sylvia immediately tends to the exhausted warrior, fussing over him with practiced affection. Ryuka's staff warns Van not to stare too closely at the unusually intimate treatment. When everyone questions Sylvia's behavior and their age difference, she calmly reveals that she and the legendary warrior are married. She enjoys caring for him, which only makes the dungeon staff more overwhelmed. Sylvia explains that her husband has cared about adventuring since they were young. Their long history allows her to manage the stubborn warrior better than anyone else. The truth astonishes Ryuka's monsters. Sylvia and Gord were childhood friends for 30 years before becoming husband and wife. Their marriage is proof that such bonds can become something more. Ryuka's staff realizes that a married pair of childhood friends has been standing before them. They immediately treat Gord and Sylvia as the ideal future they want for Van and Ryuka. Before leaving, Gord assures Van and Ryuka that nobody can take away their special connection. He and Sylvia promise to return, then withdraw from the dungeon without pursuing Ryuka any further. The dungeon staff apologize for the earlier hostility and beg the married pair to return with more stories. Sylvia admits the entire visit reminded her how deeply she still cares for Gord. After the crisis, Van and Ryuka walk together in awkward silence. Both are exhausted, yet neither can stop thinking about the example Gord and Sylvia left behind. Van wonders aloud whether he and Ryuka might end up like the married childhood friends when they grow older. The possibility leaves both of them flustered, and they retreat behind weak denials. Gord's party decides to remain in the city and prepare thoroughly before challenging the dungeon again. Ryuka may have spared them, but the legendary warrior refuses to accept defeat as the end. At the guild, veteran adventurers crowd Van for details about defeating Gord and meeting him inside the dungeon. Van downplays the achievement, while the others struggle to understand his courage. Inside the dungeon, the Minotaur becomes obsessed with growing stronger. Believing pure love requires strength, he begins harsh training to clear his thoughts and prove himself worthy. The succubus asks Van how he normally trains, hoping his routine can help the Minotaur. Van is surprised by the question, but agrees to explain what made him powerful. Van says he spends his time making sword swings and training on a nearby mountain. The explanation is so vague that nobody understands how it produced his extraordinary strength. Gord enthusiastically supports Van's mountain training and claims high-altitude exercise strengthens the entire body. Everyone else wonders why the legendary warrior has suddenly become obsessed with mountains. The succubus remembers being dismissed from a previous dungeon as useless and ordered to find another job. The humiliation still drives her need to prove that she can meet the expectations placed on her species. While trying to meditate, the succubus cannot stop imagining Van and Ryuka spending time together and moving toward marriage. Her training collapses under the same romantic fantasies she keeps projecting onto everyone else. The Minotaur explains that his muttering came from meditation, meant to clear distracting thoughts. The succubus mistakenly believes those thoughts concern her and becomes even more convinced that he is in love. The succubus weighs whether a relationship could help her live up to expectations, even if her partner is not human. Her attempt to treat romance as professional training only deepens the misunderstanding with the Minotaur. The Minotaur realizes that training alone has limited him. By combining abilities with other monsters and separating personal feelings from work, he can become far more effective inside the dungeon. The succubus reaches the opposite conclusion and stops trying to clear her mind. She decides to fuel herself with constant fantasies about Van and Ryuka until those emotions become usable power. Images of the childhood friends burn so vividly in the succubus's mind that she awakens the power of Fenrir. Her shameless imagination produces a genuine and terrifying increase in strength. The four monsters combine their abilities and celebrate the result. The succubus's incompetence becomes the perfect decoy, allowing the others to strike until they believe no adventurer can defeat them. Their confidence collapses when the entire group becomes trapped by its own plan. The four self-proclaimed geniuses can only wonder how their training ended in another disaster. Elsewhere, Van and Ryuka discover an ornate treasure chest that smells faintly of food. Ryuka imagines asking her maid for pudding, while Van cautiously examines the suspicious container. The chest pulls them into a cramped space, where Van worries that moving will hurt Ryuka. He considers breaking through the wall, but the strange prison does not behave like an ordinary room. Ryuka's trapmakers reveal that the chest is a mimic connected to another dimension. They can hear Van and Ryuka inside and settle down to enjoy the private conversation they deliberately engineered. Inside the mimic, Van and Ryuka find written directions and begin following them. Neither realizes that Ryuka's staff is listening to every word from the trap laboratory. The instructions use an embarrassing code that the watchers interpret as a demand for kissing. Even Happy hesitates, and the group argues over rock, paper, scissors, rather than admitting how indecent their plan has become. Van and Ryuka ignore the trap's romantic expectations and recall another time they were caught in a storm together. Ryuka teases Van for crying, only for him to remind her that she cried too. The false dimension opens beneath a wide night sky, giving the childhood friends a clear view of the stars. The danger fades as they sit together in the quiet landscape. Van explains that he memorized places with beautiful night skies so he could share them with someone important. Ryuka asks whether he still plans to adventure, even after growing older. Van invites Ryuka to go stargazing with him again, and she accepts with a warm smile. The eavesdropping monsters immediately discuss building a wedding hall while the pair are trapped inside. The mimic interprets their tender conversation as pillow talk, even though nothing physical happened. Its confused reaction exposes how aggressively the dungeon staff tried to force romance into the trap. The mimic finally releases everyone in a tangled heap. Happy grabs Ryuka's tail in the confusion and is immediately ordered to let go, ending the operation in undignified chaos. The staff proposes another plan: create a frightening situation that makes Ryuka cry, then have Van comfort her. One monster objects that forcing a girl to suffer is not romance but cruelty. Before the argument can continue, Ryuka's maid overhears talk of handcuffs, bombs, and love potions. Her arrival instantly makes the conspirators realize how criminal their matchmaking sounds. The maid is one of Ryuka's most reliable subordinates, handling every duty flawlessly and wielding authority beyond much of the executive board. Her competence makes the reckless planners visibly nervous. Ryuka trusts the maid and has already told her about Van, but the staff still worries about their first meeting. Someone, this devoted to the dungeon, may not react calmly to a human adventurer entering her master's life. Ryuka's maid questions why the other monsters constantly spy on their boss from the shadows. Their excuses reveal that Happy was recently hiding inside Ryuka's room, confirming how far the matchmaking has gone. The maid orders the conspirators to prepare for punishment, but Ryuka interrupts because she is hungry. Her stomach takes priority, and the maid immediately leaves to prepare a meal. Ryuka attacks the food with the enthusiasm of a spoiled princess who forgot her manners. Van is invited to stay for dinner, turning the dungeon's punishment meeting into a crowded feast. During dinner, the staff repeats Sylvia's romantic stories and imagines Van wiping sauce from Ryuka's cheek. Ryuka tries to eat normally, while everyone around her constructs another fantasy relationship scene. The maid finally asks the question everyone has avoided. Ryuka behaves this way because she is in love with Van, does she not? The direct accusation freezes the entire table. Ryuka launches into a frantic string of denials and insists that she and Van are only friends. Her staff immediately recognizes the reaction and loudly labels her a complete tsundere. Every monster in the room joins the chant, declaring Ryuka a tsundere until her embarrassment becomes unbearable. Van remains caught in the middle of another confession that never quite happens. The golem maid explains that she survives on Ryuka's mana and has no need for food. Watching her master eat happily is enough to satisfy her, which makes Ryuka suspect the others have corrupted even the reliable maid. The maid offers to cook for Van every day, but that would require him to cross the dungeon twice daily. They compromise on 2 dinners a week because the guardians cannot survive that many extra beatings. Elsewhere, monsters gather inside the wormhole for a rare matchmaking party. Happy arrives excited to experience one of the social events she has only heard about. The event divides participants by dungeon floor and gives monsters from different areas a chance to meet. Such gatherings are unusual because most dungeon workers rarely leave their assigned territory. Happy hopes to find a special partner and believes real romance will improve the advice she gives Ryuka. Her confidence is based entirely on watching other people's relationships from the shadows. Her companions decline to join the hunt, so Happy moves from table to table alone. She vows to return with mature romantic techniques that will finally help Ryuka and Van. A worried companion follows Happy to prevent her from causing trouble. The precaution proves necessary the moment Happy begins treating the matchmaking party like a field experiment. Happy uses a fake profile and introduces herself as Pico, a 22-year-old art lover. She immediately tells the table that she was knocked out by the adventurer Van. Van's name terrifies the dungeon monsters, who remember his unreadable expression and overwhelming strength. The conversation collapses before Happy can turn the encounter into useful dating research. Happy is invited to an after-party and briefly imagines she has succeeded. Looking at the suspicious group around her, she realizes they may appear just as dangerous as the monsters she usually mocks. A lich enthusiastically promises wealth and invites the women aboard his so-called train to riches. Happy tries to determine whether this bizarre sales pitch counts as a romantic event. Happy decides to test the lich's confidence by leaning closer with an unsettling smile. The skeleton's bravado disappears as she takes control of the conversation. Happy's real profile exposes her true hobby, watching Ryuka. Her matchmaking mission has never been about finding love for herself, only collecting ideas to interfere with her boss. Happy's fake persona collapses as the matchmaking party grows wilder. The skeleton beside her realizes that the harmless-looking harpy is far more dangerous than her profile suggested. The companion who followed Happy sees her getting along with the skeleton and decides she no longer needs protection. Relieved, the watcher returns to the party and leaves them together. By the end of the night, Happy gets drunk, starts singing, and destroys the venue with her voice. Her attempt to study romance leaves the matchmaking hall in ruins. A heavily armored monster named Pan appears at the dungeon entrance, surprising the goblin assigned to floor 1. The unfamiliar recruit has arrived just as the dungeon faces a staffing problem. The executive board realizes they forgot to adjust the next day's shifts. With no replacement available, Cobb the goblin will have to guard the first floor alone against every incoming adventurer. The executives refuse to abandon their own duties, leaving Cobb to manage the floor by himself. He stops complaining and prepares the traps, expecting a long and exhausting day. Pan reveals that Wool sent him to help and that he is new to the dungeon. Cobb is suspicious, but the armored monster's arrival gives him a partner before the next adventurers enter. Pan explains that Wool once helped him and he wants to repay the favor. When a party approaches, he confidently asks Cobb to let him handle the first battle. Cobb quickly discovers that Pan has power but almost no finesse. He lectures the newcomer about basic combat, warning that raw strength alone will only create more work for the dungeon. Pan ignores the criticism and charges forward in perfect condition. His excitement explodes as he declares that he is ready to crush the approaching adventurers. Cobb explains the dangerous people Pan must recognize, including Gord and the soulless-eyed rookie Van. Strong adventurers are usually left to the lower floors, while Floor 1 focuses on testing and motivating beginners. Between battles, monsters repair walls, reset traps, refill item supplies, and drag defeated adventurers outside. Pan learns that running a dungeon requires constant labor beyond simply attacking intruders. Pan adapts at an astonishing pace while facing a C-rank brawler, a B-rank mage, and a healer. Cobb admits he has never seen a new monster master dungeon combat so quickly. Impressed by the results, Cobb asks whether Pan would consider joining permanently. Rumors have already spread that an unusually strong monster has appeared on the first floor. A stronger adventurer arrives to investigate the rumors, and Pan meets him head-on. The armored recruit knows that this battle will determine whether the dungeon truly accepts him. Pan pushes himself beyond caution because he wants the famous warrior Gord to leave satisfied. His desire to prove his worth turns the test into a dangerously serious fight. Gord refuses to hold back against an opponent who will not give everything. Pan's reckless charge is punished immediately, while Happy complains that she wanted time to chat with the newcomer. After the fight, Gord tells Pan that staying near strong adventurers will help him improve. He invites the monster to seek him out again whenever he needs guidance. Wool reveals that Pan is a rare monster with a large bounty on his head. Sending him to Ryuka's dungeon gives Pan safety and a future, while the others predict the talented newcomer will go far. Ryuka's monsters notice that Van now restrains himself as he crosses the dungeon, yet he still overwhelms every floor. His effortless progress makes them wonder whether their attempts to stop him serve any purpose. Exhausted by Van's repeated visits, the dungeon monsters offer him a free pass through every floor. Few adventurers reach this far anyway, and fighting him daily has become pointless labor. Before the policy can change, a former mistress of the dungeon returns with a mission for Ryuka's 4 commanders. Her sudden presence silences the monsters who were trying to avoid their duties. The returning dragon moves past Van in an instant and strikes one of the commanders before anyone can react. Her speed proves that retirement has not weakened her authority or power. She warns that assassins may disguise themselves as Ryuka's closest companions to gain passage. Van's strength matters, but trust alone cannot protect the dungeon from enemies who exploit personal bonds. The former mistress gathers the 4 commanders and asks whether they understand why she assigned them to Ryuka. Their recent incompetence has made that responsibility impossible to ignore. She reminds them that they rank among the world's strongest monsters, then condemns them for abandoning discipline and collapsing from exhaustion. The 4 are promised personal punishment for disgracing the executive board. Ryuka arrives and freezes when she recognizes the woman. The former ruler of the dungeon has returned without warning, bringing old authority and a new test for her daughter. Ryuka's mother explains that retirement has been busy with mana harvesting and other duties. Life outside the dungeon is difficult, but she and the retired monsters are managing. Ryuka assures her mother that she is no longer lonely. Her 4 foolish commanders keep her company. Van lives nearby, and he now joins her for dinner regularly. Her mother warns that friendship between humans and monsters may become dangerous. A new archfiend will eventually appear, and another generation of heroes will rise to oppose it. When the next archfiend emerges, humans and monsters will be pulled into a violent conflict. Ryuka's bond with Van may be tested by forces far larger than their peaceful dungeon life. The former Dragon Queen takes the executive board's place and challenges Ryuka personally. Once feared almost as much as the archfiend, she intends to judge whether her daughter can protect the future she wants. With a casual use of magic, the former queen expands the chamber to the size of a small country. The altered battlefield gives both dragons enough room to release their real power. She tells Ryuka to stop behaving like a child and stand as the dungeon's challenger. Their family reunion becomes a formal duel between the current boss and the legendary ruler who trained her. Ryuka accepts the challenge and rushes forward. Mother and daughter collide with enough force to tear across the artificial landscape created inside the dungeon. The former queen counters Ryuka's first assault with overwhelming precision. Each strike forces Ryuka to defend, proving that her mother's combat experience remains far beyond ordinary monsters. Ryuka breaks through the pressure and launches a rapid series of slashes. Her mother avoids the attacks, while measuring how much the current Dragon Lord has grown. The former queen asks whether Ryuka is still hiding her true strength. She refuses to accept restraint from a daughter who may one day face heroes and the Archfiend. Ryuka answers with a massive blast that rips across the expanded floor. The attack finally forces her mother to acknowledge the power she has been holding back. Even under pressure, Ryuka refuses to kill. Her dungeon follows a strict no-killing policy, and she believes Van shares the same conviction, regardless of what the coming Archfiend demands. Ryuka's mother reveals that Van once nearly killed a monster after losing control of his anger. She warns that childhood affection does not erase the danger created by their different positions. The former queen asks whether Van and Ryuka truly believe their relationship can remain unchanged. Human and monster responsibilities may eventually force them to stand on opposite sides. Van and Ryuka answer together that a childhood friend remains a childhood friend forever. Neither is willing to abandon the bond that shaped their lives. Ryuka's mother accepts their resolve but demands proof from Van. She attacks with multiple tails and asks whether he will surrender his right to see Ryuka when the danger becomes overwhelming. Van draws his sword and cuts through the first wave of tail strikes. Rather than retreat, he uses the strength built through years of dungeon visits to hold his ground. The battle tears across the expanded floor as Van deflects one attack after another. The force of their collision gouges the landscape and sends debris flying in every direction. Van slips inside the queen's reach and locks her arm with an upper arm restraint. His unexpected technique stops the larger dragon without requiring a lethal strike. The former queen struggles against Van's hold and realizes the young human has surpassed her expectations. His refusal to kill has not made him weak or incapable of protecting Ryuka. Unable to break free without escalating the fight, Ryuka's mother raises her hand and yields. The duel ends with Van still maintaining control. She admits defeat and explains that the attack was a test. She needed to know whether Van could stand against the dangers that will eventually threaten Ryuka. Ryuka interrupts, furious that her mother fought Van so seriously after seeming to disapprove of him. The former queen's use of multiple bodies and surprise attacks only makes the test look more excessive. Ryuka's mother apologizes for leaving important family matters unresolved and jokes that her husband is probably crying at home. She came because parental worry outweighed every official obligation. The former queen turns directly to Van Sirius and studies the boy her daughter trusts. Her earlier suspicion gives way to a far more respectful assessment. She warns that the next Archfiend may rival Van in strength, and that a hero could appear soon after. Van finds the possibility exciting, while Ryuka worries about the conflict it could bring. Before leaving, Ryuka's mother reminds her daughter to eat properly and look after herself. Ryuka watches her go, admitting that the former Dragon Queen remains terrifyingly strong. Peace returns, and Van and Ryuka begin a card game by summoning Kephide, the hero of the North. His powerful level is balanced by a disastrous lack of direction. The game, Brave Fighters, lets players summon famous heroes and battle opposing decks. Van and Ryuka immediately turn the match into another competitive argument. A card based on Gord appears with enormous defense and modest attack. Although he is not officially a hero, his real achievements made him famous enough to enter the game's roster. Van activates a summoning effect and calls the great hero prominence from his deck. Guild members helped him build the strategy, giving him a card Ryuka did not expect. An emergency alert interrupts the match before either side can win. Van stands immediately and promises to fight, while Ryuka prepares to identify the threat entering her dungeon. A group of monsters from another dungeon storms the entrance and boasts that they will wipe out every weak defender. Their confidence remains high, even though the long journey has already exhausted them. The invading leader recognizes the succubus as the useless employee he once chased away and tries to fire her again. She proudly answers that she now works for Ryuka's dungeon and no longer belongs to him. The succubus insults her former dungeon and declares Ryuka's home superior in every way. Her old boss mocks her current relationship, turning the confrontation into a personal grudge. The Minotaur steps forward and calls the succubus one of their precious teammates. His defense leaves her stunned, and proves that Ryuka's dungeon values her despite her failures. Encouraged by his support, the succubus nervously asks the Minotaur to share a meal with her someday. He accepts, and the surrounding monsters erupt in celebration over the unexpected progress. The visitors identify themselves as the executive board of Ogre Organs, a vast dungeon in a neighboring country comparable to the wormhole. They came to display their strength before one specific person. Their boss, Belphegor, was defeated, so the fanatical board has chosen Ryuka as its new object of devotion. Ryuka's commanders refuse to let outsiders claim their Dragon Lord. The invaders praise Ryuka's adorableness, charisma, and figure, promising to spread her image across the world. Their plan is not conquest but an obsessive campaign built around their new idol. Ryuka's own staff is devastated that strangers might be more devoted to her. The argument becomes a competition over who understands and worships the Dragon Lord most deeply. Both groups produce embarrassing proof of loyalty, including Ryuka's old pajamas, and refuse to back down. Van arrives to find two teams preparing to settle their fandom through a formal contest. The rival groups take their positions and glare across the arena. Ryuka's service has somehow become the prize in a battle between competing fan clubs. The competition will decide which dungeon rightfully deserves to serve Ryuka. Each side appoints warriors whose devotion, creativity, and knowledge of the Dragon Lord will determine the winner. Ryuka's team introduces Wool's hidden muscles, Happy's speed and lethal voice, the reliable Minotaur, and a trap specialist. The familiar monsters represent their dungeon as the Elite Four. Ogre Organs answers with its own eccentric champions, including artists, cooks, and fanatics converted by their co-workers. Their skills are strange, but their devotion to Ryuka is genuine. The organizers present the distinguished judge who will score each round. Both teams fall silent because the decision will define who may continue calling themselves Ryuka's greatest supporters. Ryuka is placed at the center of the spectacle and realizes the entire contest is about her. The attention leaves her embarrassed, while Van watches the fan clubs take the absurd rivalry seriously. The first challenge is an art competition. Each team must produce captivating drawings, and the first side to win 2 rounds will be crowned champion. The judge announces the opening round and encourages both teams to entertain the audience. Brushes hit the canvas as the rivals race to prove they can depict Ryuka better than anyone else. Both teams finish at astonishing speed without sacrificing detail. Their polished work shows that neither group is new to drawing Ryuka, although some costume choices are deeply questionable. The rival artists explain that they create their own Ryuka merchandise because their dungeon lacks access to her. Ryuka's team counters with drawings of the ideal Dragon Lord they know personally. Ryuka happily approves every portrait, but her own team has not completed a single acceptable drawing. The 4 monsters realize that blind praise will not help them win and demand clearer feedback. The rival team presents several polished works, while 3 of Ryuka's entries remain embarrassingly crude. Ogre Organs becomes certain that the first round already belongs to them. Ryuka blushes at the glamorous version of herself on the canvas. As the artists whisper about the dramatic improvement, she becomes even more self-conscious about being judged as their model. The Minotaur finally attacks the canvas with furious inspiration, pouring every fantasy about Ryuka into his brushwork. Both teams wait to see whether passion can rescue the losing side. His finished picture places Ryuka in an embarrassingly seductive pose. The Minotaur calls it proof of devotion, while his teammates argue that such a private fantasy can never be shown publicly. Happy's excitement gives her a massive nosebleed that splashes across the drawing. The ruined entry is disqualified, handing the first round to the rival team. The fan art challenge expands with special portraits of Ryuka and Van chosen from audience submissions. The additional works reveal how widely their unusual friendship has already captured attention. After an overwhelming first-round defeat, Ryuka's team faces elimination. One more loss will allow Ogre Organs to claim victory and call itself the Dragon Lord's greatest supporter. The second round becomes a mana collection contest. Both teams must fight adventurers and absorb power while minimizing injuries, with Ryuka judging which group performs better. Because Happy is unavailable, the rivals suggest adding the succubus to Ryuka's team. They expect her incompetence to sabotage the dungeon from within. The enemy openly mocks the succubus as useless by wormhole standards. The Minotaur immediately supports her, and Ryuka's team accepts her as an emergency substitute. Her friends remind the succubus how hard she has worked, and refuse to let the rival monsters insult her. Their trust gives her enough courage to enter the round, despite her fear. The succubus agrees to compete, while the Minotaur begins collecting mana for his team. Both groups head toward the middle floors to find adventurers and test which method works faster. A full-size magic monitor is installed, so Ryuka can watch the competition from the venue. She settles in as judge, while both teams search the dungeon for targets. The succubus and Minotaur encounter an adventuring party, but immediately begin an awkward argument. The confused humans draw their weapons, unable to tell whether the monsters are fighting them or each other. The succubus grabs the Minotaur's hand and begs him to hear her out, while he refuses to look at her. Ryuka and the spectators are stunned that the contest has turned into a lover's quarrel. When the rivals mock the succubus, the Minotaur angrily defends her as his girlfriend. His harsh description of her flaws still ends with the admission that he chose her and will not tolerate insults. The commentators realize the pair are reenacting a humiliating romance drama to confuse the adventurers. The argument keeps every human distracted while the monsters position themselves for the mana harvest. The Minotaur's performance becomes genuine when the enemy continues insulting the succubus. He declares that only a fool would mock his girlfriend, then strikes back with real anger. The succubus admits that her previous relationship left her terrified of abandonment. The Minotaur tells her she is nothing like his past and finds her insecurity strangely charming. Resolving the misunderstanding in front of everyone, the staged lovers' quarrel stops the adventurers and draws out a powerful emotional reaction. Their anger, sympathy, and resolve produce enough mana for Ryuka's team to absorb. The adventurers eventually realize the argument was an act, but they discover the trick too late. The mana created by their emotional investment has already been collected. The Minotaur praises the succubus for putting her heart into the performance. His approval matters more than the score, because the feelings she revealed were not entirely false. The succubus admits that her dramatic words reflect how she genuinely feels about him. The rivals are overwhelmed by the sudden sincerity and the enormous wave of emotion it produces. Ryuka's team completes the mana harvest and wins the round. The improvised drama succeeds because it draws out the succubus's true feelings instead of relying on charm magic. The judges discover that the succubus is still a virgin, making her a mythical unicorn-approved rarity. Her lack of experience becomes another bizarre source of praise, rather than a professional failure. Ogre Organs abandons sentimental tricks and decides to seize the next adventurer directly. Their champion prepares to hunt a target and collect mana through straightforward combat. The target who appears is Van. Everyone in the city knows Ryuka's dungeon follows a no-killing policy. But the outsiders have no idea how dangerous her childhood friend is. The rival monsters rush Van and immediately notice something wrong. He shows almost no usable mana, despite the pressure around him. Their chosen target is the worst possible opponent for the challenge. Van tears through the Ogre Organs team before they can adjust. Their confident attack becomes a one-sided beating that leaves the arena buried in wreckage. The organizers call Van's appearance an unforeseeable accident and award the rivals sympathy instead of mana. Van leaves after the rampage, allowing the contest to continue without further destruction. With one victory on each side, the competition reaches a final deciding round. Ryuka's two fan clubs must now prove which group truly knows her best. The last challenge combines a quiz about Ryuka with a death match. Every correct answer grants an attack, and the first team to lose its game piece loses the entire contest. The opening question asks what Ryuka's father gave her for her 6th birthday. Both teams race to answer before Ryuka confirms the correct memory herself. Questions about Ryuka's childhood food, her first trap, and its disastrous failure trigger attack after attack. The rival contestant answers so quickly that the Minotaur can barely withstand the punishment. Happy's privately written fan book contains even the most embarrassing details of Ryuka's life. The dungeon team uses it as an information weapon, while Ryuka demands to know what everyone is reading. The monsters claim Happy's obsessive research helped them understand Ryuka more deeply. Their gratitude only confirms that years of spying have been organized into a complete archive. A harder question asks about the first gift exchanged between Ryuka and a boy. The answer reaches back to her earliest days with Van. The correct response brings back a cherished memory, and Ryuka admits that she still keeps the gift displayed in her room. Her sentimental attachment briefly silences the competing fan clubs. The final question asks how many times a boy has stayed overnight in Ryuka's room. The unexpectedly personal subject leaves everyone waiting for an answer that could decide the contest. The quiz reaches its most dangerous question. Does Ryuka have a boy she likes? Every contestant turns toward her, knowing the answer matters far more than the competition. Ryuka panics and shouts that she and Van are only childhood friends, then declares the question invalid. Her frantic reaction gives the audience all the confirmation it needs. Both fan clubs erupt over Ryuka's embarrassment and call her irresistibly adorable. The quiz stops mattering as everyone celebrates the reaction they wanted to see. The rival captain screams in frustration when the match slips out of control. Loyalty to Ryuka has turned a simple quiz into a personal crisis for every contestant. The Minotaur absorbs another hit but refuses to surrender. Even after the quiz has become chaos, he remains determined to protect his team's chance of serving Ryuka. A rival contestant loses patience and throws a direct punch outside the quiz rules. The blatant violation turns the final round into an actual fight. The organizers point out that the last quiz question was already finished, making the attack pointless. The fan clubs abandon the score and confront each other over what Ryuka's happiness truly means. Both teams charge at once, shouting over one another as the competition collapses. Ryuka can only watch her supposed supporters attack each other in her name. Ryuka's team argues that love means protecting her happiness, while the rivals defend their obsessive devotion and official fan book. Each side accuses the other of wanting Ryuka for itself. The dispute reaches its peak when one fan admits wanting to remain beside Ryuka forever. Their devotion is sincere, but possession and support have become dangerously confused. In a neighboring country's strange dungeon, a sealed princess of the Dark Dragon clan demands a hero. She needs a human's white mana to break her prison and return above ground. Back at the contest, the rival fans explain that Ryuka became their safe haven. Seeing her healthy and smiling gave them hope even from a distant dungeon. They refused to let anyone destroy the ideal that gave them comfort. Their exaggerated devotion grew from a genuine need for happiness, not merely merchandise or rivalry. Ryuka's own staff answers that their greatest joy is watching their boss live safely and happily. Serving her means supporting the life she chooses, including her bond with Van. The rivals finally admit that even fan art of Ryuka marrying Van can represent an ideal future. What once looked like betrayal becomes another form of wishing for her happiness. The two groups lower their weapons and recognize each other as genuine fans. Ryuka is relieved to meet supporters who care about her, even if their methods went far beyond reason. Ryuka forces the visitors to apologize to the goblin they beat during their arrival. The rivalry cannot end peacefully until they take responsibility for the damage caused in her dungeon. Ogre Organs accepts defeat, thanks Ryuka's team for the artwork, and submits to any punishment she chooses. They abandon the plan to take her away and acknowledge her current home. The inter-dungeon competition ends with both fan clubs united around Ryuka's happiness. What began as a territorial dispute becomes an unlikely alliance between obsessive supporters. Afterward, Ryuka's commanders review the dungeon's defenses. They can still stop most adventurers, but exceptional fighters like Van have exposed how much the current system must change. The former rivals pledge to support Ryuka until their bodies fail to their bodies, and even promise that their descendants will continue serving her. The competition ends with a devotion far stronger than before. After the merger, the expanded dungeon harvests another large supply of mana from adventurers. The growing organization now has enough power to support more monsters and defenses. Ryuka becomes buried beneath mountains of reports from the newly combined dungeons. The work follows her even during meals, leaving the Dragon Lord exhausted and irritable. Her staff imagines a magic crystal device that could store information, perform calculations, draft documents, and produce text through a clicking keyboard. The fantasy reflects how desperately they need faster administration. Ryuka stares at the endless paperwork and quietly calls for Van. She no longer needs help fighting intruders. She needs someone she trusts to rescue her from office work. The merger with Ogre Organs has multiplied reports, employee registrations, and administrative duties. Ryuka makes Van help with the documents, and then demands a shoulder massage when the workload leaves her aching. Van moves closer to help, and Ryuka eagerly offers him another task. Her flustered wording nearly turns the innocent assistance into something far more embarrassing. Ryuka decides the dungeon needs feedback from actual adventurers and asks Van for his opinion. He offers to question people at the guild and gather useful suggestions from experienced explorers. Van returns to the paperwork while Ryuka settles beside him. Their quiet cooperation makes the merged administration manageable, even as the staff secretly watches them work together. The guild sends a flood of feedback about stairs, traps, and floor design, mixed with shameless comments about Ryuka. Van separates useful advice from harassment and searches for a veteran's practical report. Sylvia's submission begins with an elaborate story about being surrounded by trolls on floor 32. The account contains valuable details, but her love of storytelling buries them beneath a long ramble. Van and Ryuka review the reports side by side, while the dungeon staff observes their familiar rhythm. Sharing the burden makes even tedious work feel natural between them. Van notices that Ryuka is exhausted and tells her to slow down. She finally stops forcing herself through the paperwork and allows him to support her. Ryuka falls asleep against Van, so he lifts her carefully and carries her back to her room. He promises to return the next day before leaving the resting Dragon Lord in her staff's care. The four commanders remain frozen after witnessing Van carry their sleeping boss. Ryuka's maid quietly prepares snacks, grateful that he helped her master rest after the exhausting merger. The dungeon celebrates the finished work with stew, gratin, and freshly baked cookies. Ryuka happily reaches for another serving, while everyone encourages the feast. Weeks of rich dinners begin showing on Ryuka's body. The Dragon Lord realizes she has gained weight, forcing her staff to confront a problem no battle training can solve. Ryuka tries a tighter new outfit and asks whether it suits her. Her companions immediately notice the change, while she hopes the different look will hide how snug the clothes have become. Happy mistakes Ryuka's rounded figure for pregnancy and asks how many months along she is. Ryuka furiously explains that she has merely been eating too much. The staff decides exercise is the only answer and promises Ryuka a fun way to lose the extra weight. She enjoys sports but hates the effort required to begin. Ryuka's staff recommends lean meat and intense evening exercise, then suggests training with Van. Ryuka accepts the fitness advice but warns everyone not to turn it into another romantic scheme. A warrior from a homeland famous for brutal training offers to supervise Ryuka's weight loss. He makes it clear that casual effort will not change anything. The staff builds a hellish obstacle course with ropes, walls, rolling logs, balance traps, and full-body exercises. Completing it should burn fat by forcing every muscle to work. Ryuka confidently calls the course easy until she learns it extends through the scorching 45th floor. Her trainers have replaced ordinary fitness with a survival challenge. Ryuka transforms into dragon form and decides to burn calories with her flaming breath. The workout immediately becomes dangerous for everyone standing nearby. The course collapses under the heat while the guardians flee across floor 45. Ryuka's attempt to exercise has turned the dungeon into a furnace. Van arrives early after hearing rumors that the Dark Dragon Lord has gone berserk. Ryuka is embarrassed that her private diet plan sounded like a dungeon-wide emergency. Van explains that Ryuka's body burns mana before stored calories, so wild attacks will not help until her magical reserves run low. Steady jogging is a safer solution. Van runs beside Ryuka and keeps her moving with the promise of food afterward. Her appetite becomes the motivation that finally makes the exercise effective. Elsewhere, Pan worries that he lacks the skills to support a real adventuring party. He dreams of clearing the wormhole with dependable companions someday. That dream is tested when Pan witnesses an adventuring party expel one of its own members. The familiar exile story forces him to confront what friendship means outside the dungeon. The party dog Fang consists of 3 B-rank adventurers and a support member named Pan, who once helped Cobb while disguised as a monster, now watches the group tear itself apart. Pan has never seen an adventurer expelled, and asks Cobb whether such separations happen often. Cobb expects Ryuka to be furious when she learns what is happening. Dog Fang tells Ek that cooking, errands, and support are no longer enough. They order him to retrieve a dangerous item alone if he wants them to reconsider his place. Ek refuses to beg and storms away, shouting that the party will regret discarding him. His anger hides the pain of being rejected by people he trusted. Cobb predicts that Ek will reveal hidden strength and succeed alone, because exile stories always follow that pattern. Pan is less amused and worries that their friendship has been permanently damaged. The truth is that Ek already has the ability of a high A-rank adventurer, but constantly undervalues himself. Dog Fang used a cruel exile to force him to recognize his own strength. Ek misunderstands the plan and believes his friends genuinely hate him. Pan sees how easily good intentions can destroy a bond when nobody speaks honestly. Van becomes personally invested because he cannot tolerate a childhood friend being abandoned. He asks Cobb and Pan to help reunite the party before the misunderstanding becomes irreversible. Van admits that intervening may be selfish, but he refuses to stand aside while close friends separate over a lie. The dungeon monsters agree to support his plan. Pan's fear erupts into an awakening, and Cobb immediately orders everyone to stand back. The transformed knight charges forward with one thought alone: protecting the friend he nearly lost. Even after unlocking new strength, Pan cannot control the rush of emotions behind it. Cobb braces for another attack while the others realize the conflict has grown far more dangerous than expected. Pan barrels toward Ek, but the confrontation collapses into raw confusion instead of a clean fight. Their companions shout over one another as years of hurt finally spill into the open. Van refuses to let another childhood friendship end in silence. He demands that Pan and Ek speak honestly, then promises to prove just how foolish it is to fight someone who has always mattered. Ek plants himself in front of his friend and refuses to retreat. Even while the others warn that the situation is dangerous, he makes it clear that abandoning Pan is no longer an option. The members of Dog Fang finally admit why they pushed Ek away. They believed their weakness was preventing him from reaching his full potential. Their clumsy sacrifice only left every side wounded and misunderstood. With the crisis settled, Van and Ryuka immediately start another childish argument. Ryuka scolds him for entering without permission, while Van accuses her of being petty until the entire room watches them bicker like an old married couple. The dungeon staff quietly abandon their absurd 99-year romance campaign after seeing Van and Ryuka quarrel so naturally. Happy still finds the pair adorable, though neither of them notices the audience studying every word. Ryuka insists Van has always been irresponsible, and her memories return to the days when he first wandered into the dungeon as a reckless child. Those early visits explain why every monster knows him so well. As a boy, Van hid among the dungeon's supply crates and repeatedly slipped past the guardians. Even when they threw him outside, he studied every corridor until he could descend without relying on brute force. Van eventually reached the deepest floor entirely on his own, shocking monsters who had expected him to give up long before that point. His stubborn curiosity had already carried him farther than most trained adventurers. The guardians watched Van push himself until he could barely stand. Whenever exhaustion threatened to break him, their battles became carefully measured tests, rather than attempts to crush the boy outright. The monsters felt guilty every time they defeated him, yet their duty demanded that they protect the dungeon. More than anything, they feared that one harsh loss might stop Van from visiting Ryuka forever. But Van never stayed discouraged. After every defeat, he wiped his face, promised that he would win next time, and marched home already planning another route through the dungeon. By the age of 12, Van's relentless training had transformed him. He could finally trade blows with the Guardians, and his rapid growth forced them to treat each visit as a genuine battle. Van eventually defeats one of the Guardians who had tested him for years. The monster bursts into proud tears, while Van accepts the victory without mocking the opponent who helped him grow. From that day forward, the Dungeon Guardians swear to face Van with everything they have. His determination has earned their respect, turning every future encounter into a serious challenge rather than a favor. The next morning, Happy eagerly asks Ryuka for more stories about Van's childhood. When she wonders why he is absent, the others reveal that he has once again left to help someone in town. Van is busy carrying food and treating the aging guildmaster's injured back. He bluntly suggests retirement, but the old man still tries to assign him errands before gratefully accepting the help. After finishing the guildmaster's chores, Van heads off at full speed, while the others struggle to keep up. Even outside the dungeon, his israf solving everyone's problems leaves no room for a quiet day. Van barely returns before Happy launches herself at him with enough force to knock him backward. Her excited welcome leaves him no chance to explain where he has been, or what delayed him. Happy immediately invents another ridiculous account of Van's absence, claiming curses and transformations stole his strength. Van exposes every lie, and Ryuka punishes the little dragon by turning her into dinner once again. While the group relaxes, the conversation shifts to heroes whose fame has soured into scandal. Van notes that power and titles mean little when the person carrying them abuses the trust of others. They recall heroes who vanished, surrendered to luxury, or were defeated after losing their way. Gord argues that a bad reputation can be personal, rather than proof that every hero is corrupt. Gord admits he still wants to challenge Prominence, the legendary great hero, despite the rumors surrounding him. Van agrees that hearsay alone cannot reveal whether the man is truly dangerous. At that very moment, a lone armored stranger reaches the dungeon and calmly walks toward its depths. The guards sense enough pressure from him to realize this is no ordinary adventurer. The stranger notices Van's distracted expression and speaks to him with unsettling familiarity. Before Van can place the voice, the newcomer grins as though their reunion has already been decided. Without warning, the intruder tears through the dungeon at terrifying speed. Monsters and traps vanish beneath a single rush of force, announcing that the great hero has arrived. Every guardian sent to stop him is cut down before they can organize a defense. His movements are so fast that even veteran fighter fights see only the aftermath of each strike. The dungeon's defenders search for blood or weakness, but the great hero crosses their formation untouched. His confidence grows as the lower floors fail to slow him for even a second. Word reaches the command room that the attacker is Prominence himself. Ryuka's staff freeze at the name, knowing the world's mightiest hero is already advancing toward their master. Ryuka orders the lower staff to evacuate, while the boss and executive board prepare to face Prominence. Every trap is raised to maximum strength so the others can retreat safely. The senior guardians refuse to repeat their failure against Gord. Though Prominence is called the strongest hero alive, they swear not to let fear disgrace Ryuka or the dungeon again. Their resolve changes nothing. Prominence smashes through the elite guardians in a storm of blows, scattering the very monsters who had prepared to sacrifice themselves against him. Van finally steps into Prominence's path and stops the assault. The two face each other through the settling dust, each waiting for the other to reveal why this invasion began. Instead of attacking, Prominence studies Van and asks whether he truly does not recognize him. His familiar manner only deepens Van's confusion, until the stranger begins dropping clues from their childhood. The truth finally lands. Prominence is Prominence, Van's old neighbor from Byakuya village. Prominence laughs at the coincidence and proudly announces that he has become a hero since they last met. Prominence introduces himself to the stunned dungeon residents as the great hero, Prominence. Happy can hardly believe that the terrifying invader is simply another one of Van's childhood friends. Years earlier in Byakuya village, Van and Prominence grew up in the remote northern region of Kara. Their friendship began long before either boy carried a title capable of shaking the kingdom. Even as a child, Van returned to the village riding beside Ryuka while helping an injured dragon relearn how to fly. The sight terrified the villagers, but Prominence watched his fearless friend with fascination. The flashback reveals how poorly Prominence's village treated unusual children. While Van and Ryuka ignored the insults, Prominence learned early that anyone who stood out could become the target of fear and ridicule. Prominence explains that the youthful body before them is actually his natural appearance. The armor and terrifying smile that made him famous were never the whole person behind the title of Prominence. As children, Prominence admired Van's courage and talent more than anyone else's. Watching Van leave to become an adventurer inspired him to seek a path of his own instead of remaining in the village. Prominence later found a holy sword that awakened the moment he touched it. Being chosen as a hero dragged him into battles against a cult that released a sealed evil god in the heart of a city. Prominence defeated that calamity and saved countless lives, But victory only brought harsher missions. Before long, the public began calling him the Great Hero, a title that gave him responsibility without peace. Years of pressure left Prominence's face locked in the frightening grin everyone now recognizes. Despite the rumors and stress, he is genuinely happy to see Van and Ryuka again after so long. Ryuka recognizes the gentle boy beneath the intimidating expression and praises Prominence for remaining kind-hearted. Her simple acceptance catches him off guard, more than any enemy ever has. Meanwhile, the dungeon staff panic over the arrival of yet another childhood friend. They immediately treat Prominence as a romantic threat, and loudly demand that this supposed third wheel disappear. Their imagination spirals until they suspect Prominence may have feelings for Van. Sylvia shuts the gossip down, reminding them that the three are old friends, and deserve more respect than reckless fantasies. The staff instead focus on Ryuka, whose awkward behavior around another boy is impossible to miss. Her affection for Van remains written across her face, even while she tries to act composed. The dungeon's self-proclaimed romance experts analyze every glance as proof of pure love. Van ignores their nonsense, while Ryuka endures the constant surveillance with growing embarrassment. Prominence casually asks whether either of his childhood friends is dating. When the question turns back on him, he admits that there is a girl he likes, and that their relationship has recently grown closer. Prominence says he fell for a girl in his own party and wants to spend more time with her. Van and Ryuka eagerly press him for details, briefly restoring the easy friendship they shared as children. That warmth vanishes when Prominence states his true mission. He has been ordered to kill Ryuka as quickly as possible. The great hero's smile remains fixed, but the threat behind his words is unmistakable. Prominence draws his holy sword and strikes, yet Van intercepts the blade before it reaches Ryuka. Their reunion turns into a clash between childhood friends forced onto opposing sides. Steel erupts across the room as Van meets Prominence's full strength head-on. Ryuka and the dungeon staff can only watch while the two heroes' trade blows powerful enough to tear the chamber apart. Prominence admits that he came under direct orders and never knew Van was connected to the dungeon. His happiness at seeing them was genuine, but duty now demands that he finish the assassination. As the great hero, Prominence has been commanded to eradicate every vessel of the Archfiend. Since Ryuka is recognized as one of those vessels, he believes he cannot spare her regardless of their past. Ryuka refuses to wait helplessly and joins the fight, forcing Prominence back with her own overwhelming power. Van struggles to keep both sides from turning the misunderstanding into an irreversible tragedy. Van asks whether Prominence would kill him as well for protecting Ryuka. Ryuka declares that she stands with Van, yet he still pities Prominence, who has clearly suffered beneath the weight of his title and orders. Prominence rejects Van's pity and raises his sword again. He may hate the order, but he believes abandoning it would betray every person who depends on the great hero for protection. The holy sword answers. Prominence's resolve with a violent surge of power. Van senses that his childhood friend is no longer testing him, and prepares to face the strongest technique Prominence can unleash. Prominence closes the distance in an instant, driving Van backward beneath a crushing series of strikes. The force of their clash shakes the deepest floor, and leaves the surrounding monsters unable to approach. Prominence concentrates everything into one decisive sword technique, certain that the holy blade gives him the advantage. Van recognizes that a direct hit could end the battle before either of them can reach a compromise. Prominence reveals that his awakening strengthened far more than the sword. His speed and physical ability have risen dramatically, allowing him to challenge Van as the rival he always wanted to become. Prominence releases Scorching Blade, flooding the chamber with searing light. Van meets the attack head-on, refusing to let the blast reach Ryuka or the wounded dungeon staff behind him. The collision cracks Van's weapon, but Ryuka immediately throws him another sword. Van catches it without breaking his rhythm and returns to the fight, before Prominence can exploit the opening. Prominence vows to continue until Van surrenders, even if their duel lasts through the night. Van refuses to kill his friend and searches for a way to stop him, without answering duty with death. Gord suddenly crashes into the battle and sends Prominence flying with one furious blow. The fighter has finally reached the deepest floor, and the sight of the great hero attacking Van has enraged him. Gord demands to know why Prominence is fighting his companions. His anger is so obvious that even Prominence pauses, while Van realizes the confrontation has gained another dangerously powerful participant. Before Gord can attack again, a cheerful young woman arrives and announces that she has been searching everywhere for her master. Elektra's carefree entrance completely disrupts the tension surrounding Prominence. News of the gathering spreads through the dungeon. Van, the great hero, Gord, and Ryuka are all on the deepest floor at once. Cobb and the others rush down, convinced their boss needs immediate support. The battle is suspended long enough for everyone to share a meal and hear an explanation. Prominence introduces Elektra as his disciple, who handles the countless practical tasks attached to his work as the great hero. The two groups exchange introductions. Van explains that he and Prominence grew up in the same village. Ryuka identifies herself as the Dark Dragon Lord, and Elektra happily greets the people her master often mentioned. Van then returns to the real problem and asks why Prominence was ordered to kill Ryuka. He does not blame his friend for following orders, but he demands the truth before anyone resumes the fight. Prominence explains that dungeon bosses are classified as vessels of the Archfiend. Their immense magical power can be harvested through sacrifice, feeding a future resurrection capable of destroying entire nations. Several kingdoms have received similar prophecies and now eliminate every suspected vessel before the danger can grow. Prominence came to this dungeon because the prophecy specifically named a Dark Dragon Lord. Ryuka challenges the logic of killing innocent beings to prevent a disaster that has not happened. Prominence insists that protecting the population is his duty, yet even he cannot offer proof that sacrifice is the only solution. Gord declares that he stands with Van and Ryuka. To him, a global crisis means nothing if preventing it requires murdering a friend who has committed no crime. Elektra barely follows the argument because she is too busy admiring Ryuka's beauty and strength. Her enthusiastic compliments leave everyone speechless and make it clear that Prominence's disciple has no interest in blind obedience. Elektra explains that her parents' guild connections gave her access to rigorous training from childhood. That discipline eventually allowed her to become Prominence's disciple and accompany him on dangerous missions. Prominence insists he cannot pursue romance while carrying the great hero's obligations. He refuses to drag Elektra into that burden, but she immediately answers that serving beside him has never felt like a burden. Van defends Prominence with the pride of an older brother, praising the years of effort hidden behind his fame. Prominence's strength was earned through constant work, not simply granted by a holy sword. Elektra adds that Prominence gives away or carefully saves the rewards he receives for missions instead of chasing luxury. Her testimony reveals a far more responsible than the frightening rumors suggest. Gord and Elektra's family begin judging Prominence as a possible match for her. After hearing Van and Elektra defend his character, even the suspicious elders admit that Prominence seems like an honorable young man. The praise leaves Prominence and Elektra painfully embarrassed, but the others push them to finish the conversation they have avoided. Neither can hide that their feelings already go beyond a simple master-disciple bond. Prominence apologizes for the attack and prepares to return to the royal capital. He must report that Ryuka was not defeated and explain why he refused to complete the mission. He warns that the kingdom will eventually devise another plan against the supposed Archfiend vessel. Van tells him to return whenever he can, and Prominence promises that their friendship will survive the conflict ahead. After Prominence leaves, Van and the dungeon residents begin repairing the damage from the battle. The Guardians regret that pride kept them from asking for help before the deepest floor was nearly destroyed. Ryuka's executive board gathers to review its failure against the great hero. Realizing how far they lag behind Van and Prominence, the senior monsters commit themselves to harder training and stronger defenses. The staff's meeting quickly drifts from security to Van's growing collection of childhood friends. Their romantic speculation becomes so excessive that the practical members demand they focus on actual threats. One staff member claims the gossip comes from fear that someone will steal Van from Ryuka. The others reject the excuse, insisting that years of trust between the two deserve more faith. Mino is scolded for turning every friendship into an indecent fantasy. Her companions remind her that careless comments can insult the very people they claim to support. The group agrees that Prominence's sincere loyalty came from a healthy upbringing and a genuine bond with Van. They decide to support the childhood friends without forcing every interaction into a scandal. That resolution lasts only seconds before the monsters begin confessing their own bizarre preferences. What was supposed to be a serious discussion collapses into another argument over whose imagination is most disturbing. OCC proudly describes a fantasy in which tentacles restrain anyone threatening Van. The others recoil, but several dungeon monsters admit that their own ideas are hardly more respectable. The staff conclude that unusual preferences are not automatically harmful. The real problem begins when someone ignores consent or treats another person's private life as entertainment. They finally agree to support Van and Ryuka without spreading lewd rumors about them. Even so, several members remain convinced that the pair must have private habits they have not revealed. Away from the noisy staff, Ryuka notices that Van is still worried about Prominence. Van admits that opposing a lifelong friend hurts more than fighting any monster, and Ryuka quietly stays beside him. Van resolves to gather every piece of information available before the kingdom makes its next move. While the dungeon staff promise to watch for danger, one shameless spectator proves that not every threat is external. Ryuka catches Van watching her and asks what is wrong. Before he can answer, the hidden staff misread the glance and begin whispering about the dungeon boss's collarbone. The observers convince themselves that Van has developed a collarbone fetish, even though nothing unusual happened. Ryuka senses nearby voices, and the eavesdroppers realize their harmless gossip may soon become a painful mistake. Ryuka confronts the four idiots spying on them and rejects every ridiculous theory. Their supposed support has crossed into an invasion of privacy, leaving Van embarrassed and the staff desperate to escape punishment. Later, the guilty monsters drink together and continue celebrating every tiny interaction between Van and Ryuka. A simple brush of their fingers becomes proof of romance. Once the alcohol loosens everyone's imagination, the drunken group corners Ryuka and demands to hear her private preferences. Van refuses to participate in anything violent, but their relentless teasing pushes Ryuka's patience past its limit. Ryuka sends the noisy staff flying through the dungeon before they can ask another question. Their late-night celebration ends beneath her fists, restoring peace far more quickly than any formal warning. The next day, Van trains without a sword, because Prominence shattered his old weapon. Even barehanded, he tears through the practice course so fiercely that the dungeon staff struggle to follow his movements. Ryuka realizes Van has been testing new methods while waiting for a replacement. Rather than let him keep fighting unarmed, she proposes that the dungeon forge a new sword specifically for him. The monsters form a weapon committee and summon a dwarf who specializes in advanced crafting. Since Van has conquered the deepest floor countless times, they want a blade worthy of his proven strength. The dwarf chief arrives by smashing through the workshop floor, immediately demonstrating the same destructive confidence he brings to every project. Even the other craftsmen are unsettled by his entrance. He is introduced as Dwao, head of the trap department and creator of the anti-Van traps below the 45th floor. His knowledge of Van's fighting habits makes him the ideal weapon designer. Dwao boasts that he understands Van better than anyone outside Ryuka because he built countless machines meant to stop him. His arrogance is unbearable, but no one can deny his technical skill. The committee studies Prominence's holy sword Calendula as the standard they must surpass. Its tremendous mana output can cut through almost anything, so Van's new weapon must endure power on the same level. The staff offer dramatic ideas about a sword that protects Van through every crisis. Dwao immediately rejects their fantasies and demands practical designs based on how Van actually fights. One proposal is an ice blade that releases freezing air and even stores ice cream in the hilt. The committee dismisses the novelty because comfort means nothing if the weapon breaks against a holy sword. They next consider enchantments that could launch ranged slashes or add elemental power. Mino demonstrates a lightning enhancement, proving that magic can expand a weapon's options without changing Van's natural style. Dwao points out that Van specializes in reading an attack and countering at the perfect instant. The blade therefore needs durability above all else, along with enough power to withstand legendary weapons. The craftsmen debate orichalcum mithril, and adamantite, each praising a different strength. None alone satisfies every requirement, and the argument quickly becomes a contest of dwarven pride. Van proposes combining all three metals into one alloy. Ordinary fire cannot fuse them, but Ryuka's chaos flames may generate enough heat and magical pressure to make the impossible mixture work. The final recipe also requires a piece of Ryuka's body to bind the metals together. Ryuka recoils at the request, while the craftsman insists that her dragon material is the only ingredient powerful enough. Ryuka reluctantly provides the dragon material, then unleashes her blazing breath into the forge. The craftsmen feed the three legendary metals into the flames, while she keeps the impossible alloy molten. Dwao and his team hammer the glowing mixture without rest. Ryuka's chaos fire binds the metals together, allowing the blade to take shape without shattering under its own magical pressure. Several days later, the sword is complete. Rather than hand it over casually, Ryuka designs a special dungeon floor so Van must earn the weapon through a challenge built specifically for the two of them. The hidden route can only be entered by a party of exactly 2 people, and every trap assumes that condition. Anyone who reaches the end will receive the newly forged sword as a reward. Van and Ryuka enter the special floor together. Fighting side by side reminds them of their childhood adventures, when every unknown corridor felt exciting rather than dangerous. Once the gate closes, the trial begins. Ryuka knows the floor's purpose, but she still has to cooperate with Van because the mechanisms will punish either partner who tries to proceed alone. A barrage of handmade traps erupts from the walls, forcing Van and Ryuka to move in perfect rhythm. The dungeon staff watch proudly as their elaborate course tests speed, trust, and coordination. One trap releases a swarm of clinging, fluffy creatures that immediately surround Ryuka. She panics and tries to shake them off, while Van searches for a safe route through the chaos. Another mechanism strikes Van before he can fully protect her. Though the blow hurts, he remains focused on guiding Ryuka forward, instead of blaming the staff for their excessive enthusiasm. At the center of the floor, they find a sword, sealed in a pedestal. The inscription declares that only when 2 hearts act as one will the weapon be released. Van and Ryuka place their hands together and free the blue blade. The completed weapon, named Aestar, answers their bond with a surge of clear magical light. The celebration is interrupted when Dwao activates a new combat golem built from the leftover alloy. The machine charges Van immediately, turning the presentation into a live test of the sword. Van meets the golem's first attack with Aestar and holds his ground. The blade neither bends nor chips, even against a body forged from the same legendary materials. The golem increases its power and drives Van across the chamber. He adjusts his stance instead of forcing the weapon, learning how its balance responds to the counters that define his fighting style. The craftsmen reveal that Aestar combines mithril, orichalcum, adamantite, Ryuka's scale, and a kelpie hide grip. Every component was chosen to give Van strength, durability, and precise control. Aestar's enchantment can redirect any force that strikes the blade. Van uses it to repel the golem's blow, turning the enemy's own momentum into a defensive counterattack. Dwao warns that the ability is difficult to master because the user must control the reflected force in an instant. A poorly timed response could injure Van or send the attack in the wrong direction. Van quickly proves why the sword was made for him. He combines a punch with a redirected slash, breaks through the golem's guard, and sends the machine crashing to the floor. The craftsmen are thrilled by the successful test, though Dwao already vows to create an even stronger opponent next time. Van accepts Aestar and promises that he will never stop improving either. Ryuka formally gives the sword to Van, and his gratitude leaves her glowing with pride. Nearby staff watch the exchange in silence, convinced their carefully planned trial brought the two even closer. Van thanks Ryuka for Aestar, and her happiness is impossible to hide. The watching staff immediately suspect romantic intentions, but Van insists the gift was simply Ryuka supporting an old friend. Dwao presents the enormous bill for the rare metals and labor used in Aestar. The dungeon's treasurer nearly collapses, while Van promises to repay the cost, rather than leave Ryuka carrying the burden. Back in the royal capital, Prominence's return draws 2 very different reactions. Ordinary citizens celebrate the great hero, while people who know his intimidating personality watch him with nervous suspicion. Prominence and Electra are summoned before the throne to report their failed mission. The royal court gathers its 7 heroes, turning the dungeon incident into a matter of national security. Kefide demands an explanation for Ryuka's survival. Prominence admits that he deliberately stopped the assassination after learning the Dark Dragon Lord was Van's friend and had shown no hostile intent. The court reacts with disbelief, but Prominence refuses to hide his choice. He makes it clear that obedience does not excuse killing an innocent person without first investigating the prophecy. Prominence describes Van Sirius, the childhood friend shared by himself and Ryuka. He warns that the dungeon also contains 4 executive monsters, comparable to archfiend vessels, and an army exceeding 2,000. The ministers fear that attacking such a force would destroy the kingdom before anyone reached Ryuka. Their only realistic hope may be persuading Van to cooperate or finding another way to prevent the resurrection. Prominence admits that Van and Ryuka are precious to him, but his first duty is protecting Kara's citizens. If the prophecy proves unavoidable, he promises that his heart will not weaken a second time. Electra makes that promise harder by describing how welcoming everyone in the dungeon was. She even presents gifts they received, forcing the court to confront the possibility that their supposed enemy is not evil. When Electra mentions Van's frequent visits to Ryuka, several courtiers become fascinated by their relationship. The serious hearing briefly derails as they imagine a romance watched over by an entire dungeon. Kefide orders the room to focus and insists that someone must still confront Ryuka. Electra refuses to let any hero attack recklessly, especially when Prominence's own report proves the situation is more complicated. Electra argues that heroes can fulfill their duty without abandoning love or compassion. She proudly reveals that she has already introduced Prominence to her parents, leaving her master speechless before the whole court. The king authorizes a secret investigation into Van and the wormhole, while the heroes prepare contingencies. He wants facts before war, though the kingdom must still plan for Ryuka's defeat if the prophecy is genuine. For reinforcements, the court contacts the hero of the West and the companion who helped defeat the previous archfiend. Their experience may reveal whether the current prophecy can be stopped without another sacrifice. Prominence accepts the investigation, but declares that he will personally face Van and Ryuka if every peaceful option fails. His loyalty to them cannot erase the lives he has sworn to protect. The king asks Prominence to search for a solution in which no one dies. Saving personal friends is not the crown's highest priority, yet the ruler agrees that needless bloodshed would be a failure. Kefide remains suspicious and begins using political connections to gather information. The court's hidden factions now treat the wormhole as both a military threat and an opportunity for influence. Elsewhere, the neighboring dungeon Ogre Organs needs a new boss after its previous ruler leaves the position vacant. Battle-tested monsters from several dungeons gather for a selection tournament on its lower floors. Pan is chosen to represent the first floor in the examination. The young knight enters deep trouble immediately. Realizing that every candidate around him has come to claim command of an entire dungeon, the selection exam brings together 3 leading candidates. Pan from the first floor, a self-proclaimed rising lich, and a powerful hydra. Each represents a different kind of strength needed to command Ogre Organs. The lich hides his true confidence behind a timid disguise, hoping the judges will underestimate him. As a high-level monster already serving on the 40th floor, he sees the vacancy as his chance to rise. Pan appears exhausted before the test even begins, claiming he has felt sick since the previous day. The judges question whether the wormhole's representative can survive an examination built for veteran bosses. The first trial requires each candidate to stop a party of high-level A-rank adventurer golems. They must show overwhelming defensive power without causing severe damage, since a floor boss is meant to repel rather than slaughter. The golems charge, and the candidates are judged on control as much as force. Every excessive injury costs points, making reckless strength less valuable than the ability to neutralize a party cleanly. Pan, the Lich, and the Hydra each engage the simulated adventurers. Their methods differ sharply, but all 3 prove capable of controlling opponents strong enough to challenge an ordinary dungeon floor. Pan hesitates, because becoming a permanent floor boss would end his freedom to travel and spend time with Ryuka. The prestigious position suddenly feels more like a cage than a reward. Cobb admits he nominated Pan as a brutal learning experience rather than expecting him to win. The wormhole is full of stronger veterans, but trial by fire may force the young knight to discover his own potential. Facing combat patterns modeled after Mino and the other executives, Pan relies on familiarity rather than raw power. He predicts their habits and dismantles the golems without falling for the techniques copied from his allies. The judges award Pan an excellent score for producing enormous pressures while causing minimal damage. Even the skeptical candidates acknowledge that the supposed rookie belongs among the finalists. Pan, the Lich, and the Hydra advance to the second round, where they will face interviews the following day. Ryuka is selected as one of the judges who will decide the new boss of Ogre Organs. Cobb openly recommends Pan after his performance, but Pan is more worried that the interview will consume the time he promised Van. The unexpected praise only makes his possible promotion feel more real. The Lich congratulates himself for maintaining his harmless disguise through the entire trial. None of the judges have noticed the ambition hidden beneath his nervous act, giving him confidence before the interview. A new contender reveals herself as Vano Vermilion, the Poison Dragon Princess. She is not satisfied with Ogre Organs alone and secretly intends to claim the wormhole and its power for herself. A special popularity poll ranks the side characters, with several dungeon monsters receiving no votes at all. The results expose which familiar faces readers remembered and which ones disappeared into the background. Cobb, Prominence, and several recurring monsters land in the middle of the poll. Even Ryuka's alternate forms receive separate rankings, turning the results into another source of competition inside the dungeon. Little Ryuka, Young Happy, Saki, and even the Guildmaster's Meat Pie earn surprising support. The bizarre ranking delights Happy, who treats every vote as proof that cuteness defeats dignity. Van places third, Ryuka takes second, and Happy wins first place. The results list Ryuka under her full family name, but everyone continues calling her Ryuka as Happy celebrates the victory. When all alternate forms are combined, Happy narrowly defeats Ryuka in total votes. The staff reassure Ryuka that she remains their beloved Dragon Queen, while Happy celebrates like a conquering champion. The bonus results end with Happy and an older character trading insults about age and popularity. Their quarrel proves that even a harmless reader poll can become another battle for pride. The interview round begins with Ryuka, Cobb, and the other judges facing the finalists. Pan's nerves worsen the moment he realizes his own dungeon boss will be evaluating every answer. Pan becomes so flustered that he nearly introduces himself as Van before correcting his name. Ryuka hides an amused smile while the other judges wonder how such a nervous candidate reached the final round. The judges warn Pan that a floor boss must speak with confidence in any dungeon. They then ask each finalist to describe the kind of floor they would create if chosen. The Lich eagerly proposes building a private harem from every attractive monster he can gather. His honest answer reveals that ambition, not dungeon defense, has driven him through the examination. The Hydra describes a terrifying battlefield filled with poison, shattered bones, and constant pressure. Even while seeking promotion, it cannot understand why the judges object to methods that would traumatize every adventurer. Pan offers the opposite vision, a simple floor where he stands openly and faces challengers without tricks. His plain answer sounds unimpressive beside the others, but it reflects the honest style he learned on Floor 1. Pan explains that Cobb and the first floor monsters taught him to study opponents instead of charging blindly. Working among them turned an unfamiliar assignment into the most rewarding place he has ever served. He admits that his love for the wormhole and everyone inside it has grown too strong to leave. Ryuka is touched by his sincerity, while the harsher candidates dismiss compassion as weakness. The Hydra argues for restoring Floor 45's old poison zone, which was abolished after becoming too deadly. The judges remind it that the dungeon now forbids poison capable of killing adventurers outright. Before the debate can continue, the Hydra's body erupts and reveals the true mastermind hiding within. Vano Vermilion has used the examination to enter the wormhole's circle of leaders undetected. Vano announces herself as the Poison Dragon Princess and declares that she will defeat Ryuka before claiming the wormhole. The interview instantly becomes an assassination attempt. The staff recognize Vano as the only daughter of the former poison ruler. Her family lost its position when the lethal floors were abolished, giving her a personal reason to resent Ryuka's reforms. Ryuka orders everyone back and faces Vano alone. The Poison Princess believes the trap has worked, but Ryuka's calm response shows that cornering a Dark Dragon Lord is far harder than expected. Vano claims she has uncovered Ryuka's greatest secret by combining every rumor around Van. According to her, the dungeon boss and the human adventurer are already in a romantic relationship. She accuses Ryuka of enjoying a hidden, peaceful love life while casting poison monsters aside. Vano turns old resentment into a personal attack, insisting that the entire dungeon deserves punishment for rejecting her kind. A furious Ryuka denies that she and Van are dating while dodging Vano's assault. Her embarrassment amidst only makes the accusation sound more believable to the monsters watching from the sidelines. The four most troublesome staff members leap into the conflict, outraged that Vano insulted Ryuka's bond with Van. Even they cannot agree whether they are defending a friendship or a romance. Instead of helping, the spectators begin chanting for Van and Ryuka to kiss and settle the question. Ryuka finally roars at everyone to shut up before their gossip becomes more dangerous than Vano's poison. Pan argues that the romantic rumors are unproven and that Van's loyalty to the dungeon matters more than labels. Years of teasing have made him strangely calm about speculation that once would have shocked him. Vano reveals that her anger comes from losing the home her family considered precious. Ryuka recognizes that the princess is fighting for a place to belong, even though revenge has twisted that desire into violence. Ryuka catches Vano's charging dragon form and stops it with brute force. She warns the princess not to underestimate a dungeon boss who has defended the wormhole for centuries. Vano summons members of the Poison Dragon clan to overwhelm the judges. Her father orders the transformed warriors to finish their opponents quickly and support the princess before Ryuka can break their formation. The Poison Dragons divide their targets and attack the executive members surrounding Ryuka. Pan and the others hold the line, preventing Vano's allies from turning the interview chamber into a massacre. Ryuka releases a violent wind gust that throws the attackers away without killing them. Her controlled response proves that the dungeon's ban on lethal poison never meant its defenders had become weak. The executive members counter the clan's ranged poison with barriers and detoxification magic. Every attack is neutralized before it can spread through the room, leaving Vano increasingly desperate. The poison dragons are subdued one after another, and Vano realizes her rebellion has failed. Ryuka's people are stronger and more coordinated than the bitter stories she heard from her family. Ryuka explains that poison monsters were never expelled from the wormhole. Because deadly toxins are forbidden against adventurers, those who need to fight freely can transfer to other dungeons rather than being discarded. Vano remembers growing up on floor 45, the Poison Dragon Sea. Her clan proudly protected the Dark Dragon Lord from humans and the Archfiend, and she dreamed of becoming a boss beside her admired father. When Ryuka inherited the title of Dark Dragon Lord, she changed the dungeon's policies and reorganized its staff. Vano's father lost his executive position, and the young princess interpreted the demotion as humiliation. That resentment hardened into the belief that Ryuka had destroyed her family. Vano's father now reveals his full dragon body, forcing the princess to confront the man whose supposed ruin inspired her revenge. The battle resumes as concentrated poison floods the chamber. Even Ryuka acknowledges that the clan's toxin is dangerous, while the defenders scramble to keep it from reaching the wounded candidates. Vano's father suddenly bites down on his own daughter. The horrifying act shocks both sides, but his true goal is to pull the uncontrolled poison out of her body before it kills her. The others mistake the rescue for cannibalism and scream that Vano is being devoured. Her father ignores the panic and continues extracting the toxin until her breathing stabilizes. He absorbs nearly all of Vano's poison, placing himself in danger instead. Ryuka immediately recognizes the sacrifice and orders the staff to prepare treatment before the toxin reaches his heart. Van, still disguised as Pan, casts a spell to weaken the poison's effects and forces a potion into the dragon's mouth. Only Ryuka notices the identity hidden beneath the armor. The treatment triggers a violent reaction, but the dragon survives and insists that everyone stop looking so worried. His rough reassurance confirms that the poison is finally losing strength. With the crisis over, Vano wakes beside her recovering father. The rebellion has collapsed. Yet Ryuka chooses medical care and questioning instead of the execution Vano expected. Vano's father reveals that the Hydra had already told him about her plan. He asks why she launched a rebellion without learning what truly happened after his removal from the executive board. He admits that his own reckless violence once caused countless casualties and undermined the dungeon's new policies. Ryuka did not destroy him. She removed him from a position he was no longer fit to hold. Vano's father has spent years supporting Wormhole by producing powerful potions in secret. Vano realizes that her revenge was built on a misunderstanding he never corrected. Vano's father assures her that protecting the dungeon was once his duty, but caring for her has always come first. Losing rank never changed the pride he feels as her father. The truth breaks through Vano's anger, and she finally apologizes for attacking Ryuka. Her father accepts the tears without excusing the rebellion, making her face the harm caused by assumptions and pride. Ryuka admits that the dungeon also failed by ignoring the poison monster's grievances for too long. After reviewing the candidates, she appoints the Lich as the new boss of Floor 45. The Lich promises to restore the floor by recruiting members of the Poison Dragon clan and using non-lethal magic. His old harem dream remains suspicious, but the judges believe his plan can give displaced monsters a home. Once the ceremony ends, Ryuka confronts Van about secretly working as the armored monster Pan. Van explains that he was pushed into the role and asks to continue training there a little longer. Ryuka reveals that his disguise never fooled her because she recognized his eyes immediately. She agrees to protect the secret, amused that Van thought armor could hide him from a childhood friend. Van worries that his eyes truly look as empty as the nickname Soulless Van suggests. Ryuka studies him closely and insists they are not frightening, leaving both of them suddenly embarrassed. Vano begins visiting everyone harmed by her rebellion and offers direct apologies. The poison monsters encourage her to keep moving forward instead of hiding behind the title of princess. She apologizes to Pan, the Hydra, and the Lich before helping rebuild the damaged floors. Each meeting is awkward, but accepting responsibility slowly earns back the trust she threw away. The dungeon staff worry that Vano may cause another disaster, yet Ryuka tells them to stop treating every mistake as permanent. A misleading title or frightening species does not decide someone's future. To help Vano adjust, Ryuka shares detailed notes about dragon behavior. The information reveals that many dungeon dragons are far less social than their proud appearances suggest. Dragons often remain indoors, collect treasures, and avoid unnecessary relationships. Their independent nature makes a simple conversation with Van feel more intimidating than any battle to the newly gathered dragon girls. The room falls silent as Vano and the other dragons struggle to greet Van. Their intense staring only makes the atmosphere worse, while Van has no idea why everyone seems terrified. Vano escapes the awkwardness by reading absurd adventure novels about banished heroes, hidden reincarnations, and princess-filled revenge journeys. Her dramatic taste gives the others a new reason to worry about her imagination. She soon begins writing her own story, using Van and Ryuka as inspiration for a forbidden human-dragon romance. Ryuka catches the manuscript and demands that Vano stop turning their friendship into fiction. Their argument is interrupted when Van arrives with another visitor. He casually greets Ryuka, unaware that Vano has just written several pages about the two of them becoming lovers. Van introduces Alan, another childhood friend from Byakuya village. Ryuka remembers him only vaguely, while Alan greets her with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to meeting strangers. Vano immediately decides Alan is a dangerous extrovert, trying to build a harem. Ryuka orders her to control the fantasy, explaining that Alan's outgoing personality is not proof of a hidden scheme. Van is simply happy to see Ryuka making new friends, which makes him sound like an overprotective father. Ryuka protests that she has never been lonely, though his concern still warms her. Ryuka realizes Van brought up the subject only because he enjoys teasing her. Vano watches their effortless banter and becomes even more convinced that her romance novel is based on truth. Ryuka allows Vano to remain in the wormhole under supervision, turning a former enemy into another ally. Vano thanks her for the second chance and promises to prove that the Poison clan can belong. Vano immediately channels her gratitude into another romance manuscript about Van and Ryuka. Ryuka catches her writing and storms into the room before the fictional relationship can become even more outrageous. A separate problem begins when Mino invites Saki to dinner. Both arrive at the restaurant, pretending the meal is merely professional, though their nervous reactions suggest neither believes that explanation. Several days earlier, Saki had thanked Mino for helping her win the inter-dungeon competition. Wanting to repay him, she accepted the suggestion that they share a meal at the city's best restaurant. At the restaurant, Saki assumes the invitation is connected to work, while Mino struggles to explain his appreciation. Their awkward conversation makes the expensive dinner feel more intimidating than a dungeon battle. Happy and several staff members secretly watch from nearby tables, expecting romantic disaster. Mino's history of provoking succubi makes them especially doubtful that he can survive the evening without offending Saki. More observers join the operation, claiming they only want to protect their friends. Their obvious excitement reveals the truth. They came because watching Mino and Saki stumble through a date is too entertaining to miss. Saki orders an enormous collection of meat, oysters, eels, turtle soup, viper, gratin, and mead. Mino quietly accepts the bill, determined to let her choose whatever makes the evening enjoyable. They discuss work while Saki offers Mino portions of meat and eggs from her feast. The conversation remains stiff, but each small act of consideration begins to break through their mutual embarrassment. Mino praises Saki's progress and tells her to keep honing her craft. His sincere encouragement means more than a dramatic confession, allowing the two to relax for the first time that night. The chef then delivers a special dish designed for Saki's succubus nature. Mino has no idea why it looks so extravagant, while the hidden spectators brace for another misunderstanding. As Saki tastes the meal, both she and Mino struggle to control their reactions. The carefully prepared flavors carry an unusual warmth that makes the quiet table suddenly feel far more intimate. The chef proudly reveals that he infused the dish with Mino's vitality so Saki could feed without harming him. His enthusiastic explanation turns a thoughtful meal into an unbearably explicit public spectacle. Once the embarrassment passes, Mino tells Saki she has nothing to apologize for. He respects the way she lives differently from other succubi and calls her an outstanding person rather than judging her species. Saki answers that Mino is far more considerate than he appears. They reassure each other that neither must imitate anyone else, accepting the qualities that first made their friendship unusual. The spying staff becomes so absorbed in the heartfelt conversation that they forget their own food and grow hungry. Only then do they remember that secretly observing friends was never supposed to become an all-night mission. Back in the dungeon, Van begins another intense training session with Gord. The fighter intends to sharpen Van's counters before the kingdom sends stronger heroes against Ryuka. Gord identifies a flaw in Van's footwork. He always stops at the same distance before countering. He orders Van to vary the timing and spacing so experienced opponents cannot predict his response. Van applies the advice immediately, changes his range, and slips inside Gord's defense. The clean counter proves that he can absorb instruction in the middle of combat and turn it into action. While Van trains, Ryuka and the women organize a gathering of their own. Sylvia joins the planned tea party, giving Ryuka a rare chance to speak with friends without the dungeon's usual emergencies. At the tea party, the women compare Van and Gord. Gord loves combat more openly, but they note that Van chose him as a training partner because both men understand improvement through relentless challenge. Inside the training room, Gord increases the pressure after realizing Van can still joke during their exchange. He begins matching Van's combined strengths, instead of relying on simple power. Van adapts to every shift in rhythm, while Gord's raw combat ability keeps closing the gap. Their duel becomes a contest between rapid adjustment and overwhelming experience. The women list Van's unexpected weaknesses, including clustered fish eggs and anything that overwhelms his unusually sharp mountain-raised eyesight. Ryuka knows these details because she has watched him since childhood. Their conversation turns to romantic compatibility among co-workers. Sylvia calmly accepts the topic, but Ryuka warns everyone not to treat real people like materials that can simply be matched together. Gord releases his mana and forces Van into the hardest phase of training. The shockwave reaches the observation area, proving that neither fighter has been holding back. The women admit Gord is strong, dependable, and surprisingly adorable when his intensity shows. Ryuka briefly wonders whether someone so impressive might already have a romantic partner. They explain that Gord is popular with older adventurers, who treat him like a grandson, but girls his own age are intimidated by his fierce aura. His reliability is easier to appreciate after spending time with him. The discussion returns to Van, and Ryuka realizes he shows her a responsible side that he hides elsewhere. She wonders whether he is secretly childish at heart, until Sylvia warns her imagination is becoming as wild as Mino's. The others suggest Van works so hard because he wants to impress Ryuka. Memories of their youth support the idea, since he constantly pushed himself whenever she was watching. Ryuka loudly denies that they have that kind of relationship, yet quietly admits she might not reject Van if he confessed. At that exact moment, Van and Gord enter the supposedly private tea party. Van explains that they have been training for 6 hours, though only 2 hours passed outside. The special room slowed its internal time, allowing him to complete an exhausting session without losing the entire day. Despite the punishment, Van declares himself ready for the next challenge. Gord's lessons have sharpened his counters, and the confidence in his stance shows the training achieved its purpose. Spring cleaning begins across the wormhole, and Ryuka asks Van to inspect her room. He immediately notices that she is trying to avoid one particular area and insists on checking it. Most of Ryuka's room is spotless, but Van finds a concealed storage space she hoped he would ignore. A childhood friend cannot be fooled so easily, especially when her panic gives away the secret. The hidden room is packed with forgotten valuables, books, and keepsakes. Van compares the mess to Ryuka's father's old storage chamber and starts pulling everything out for proper sorting. Ryuka remembers the tea party's claim that Van wants to impress her and becomes self-conscious about his enthusiasm. Van simply treats the cleanup as another promise to help an old friend. They separate useful items from things Ryuka no longer needs. Van rescues neglected books and decorative accessories, refusing to let valuable possessions disappear beneath years of clutter. Among the pile, they discover a dramatic fantasy novel about darkstones, sacred swords, and 12 legendary jewels. Van tries to understand the dense lore, while Ryuka defends the book's complicated appeal. With the 4 gossiping staff members mysteriously absent, Van and Ryuka find themselves alone amid the clutter. Both sense that the quiet room could become the intimate moment everyone else has been waiting for. Spring cleaning places the wormhole in maintenance mode, but the staff still need a public display of strength. The annual stampede is scheduled so the dungeon can remind the outside world how dangerous its monsters remain. The Stampede Committee announces that the event will once again be organized as a race. Rather than attacking towns, the monsters will charge along a controlled route and compete for first place. OCC explains the course, including a wide detour around populated areas and safety rules for anyone losing control. The committee wants spectacle without allowing the race to become a real disaster. The winner will receive a luxurious prize, and the 4 troublesome staff members immediately imagine using it to send Van and Ryuka on a beach vacation together. That fantasy spreads through the competitors, who decide victory could fund a perfect trip for their boss and Van. Happy and Wool become especially determined to secure the prize. To keep the race fair, stronger monsters receive handicaps and heavy equipment. The organizers want skill and endurance to matter more than a single overwhelming burst of power. Monsters from Ogre Organs also enter now that their dungeon has become a wormhole branch. They see the stampede as a chance to prove themselves and escape their old reputation for decline. The gossiping staff quietly plan to accompany Ryuka on any beach trip, hiding nearby so they can protect her and observe every interaction with Van. Their concern is sincere, even if their methods are shameless. The racers gather outside the dungeon and study the long route toward the distant city. Many are annoyed by daylight and open terrain, but the promise of victory keeps the formation restless. The starting signal sounds, and a massive wave of monsters surges forward. The controlled stampede begins with enough force to shake the road beneath every runner. Those remaining inside watch the race live through OCC's magic. Young children cheer from safety as the commentators wonder which bizarre strategy will decide this year's winner. The executive members fall behind because their handicaps are heavier than expected. Normally they would already be near the finish, but the extra weight turns every step into a struggle. The leading group approaches the city while adventurers stand guard at the gate. Several monsters use unusual running forms, including one biped whose stride resembles a charging horse. Uni suddenly abandons the route and rushes toward a group of adventurers. She has spotted a young maiden and decides the girl would make the perfect pet, violating every safety rule at once. Gord intercepts Uni before she reaches the civilians. Their collision turns the roadside into a battlefield. While the other racers continue past the distraction, Mino becomes trapped in a separate clash with a Minotaur and loses his chance at the lead. The commentators mock Gord's apparent jealousy, though he is simply preventing another monster from attacking a girl. At the water station, the Elite Four repeatedly line up to collect rare stickers included with the drinks. Their obsession gives Wool and Han an unexpected opportunity to overtake them. Dwao equips himself with powerful golem legs and rockets through the field. Mino calls the invention cheating, but Dwao insists he is only using every capability available to him. The exhausted runners motivate themselves by imagining Ryuka in a beach outfit. An argument over whether a bikini or one piece would suit her best gives several competitors a ridiculous second wind. Neither side will surrender the swimsuit debate, and their stubbornness pushes them faster. The argument becomes an accidental racing strategy, as both groups close the distance to Dwao. With only 100 meters remaining, Uni returns to the race and several weighted favorites begin their final push. Happy and Wool still face a difficult gap, but neither accepts defeat. Happy sacrifices her own chance by kicking Wool forward with all her strength. The sudden boost launches him past the leaders and gives him one unforgettable opportunity to win for their team. 3 racers reach the line almost together, their heads stretching forward in a desperate finish. The spectators wait for the magical replay to determine whose neck crossed first. Wool wins the annual stampede by the smallest possible margin. His body stretches across the finish, while the other competitors collapse behind him in disbelief. The losers immediately protest Dwao's mechanical enhancements and the Elite Four's sticker-powered determination. Officials review every trick, but none clearly violated the unusual rules of the race. Wool admits the victory belonged equally to Happy, whose final kick created the opening. The two agree to share the prize rather than fight over which one deserves first place. The reward becomes a private beach built inside floor 85 of the dungeon. Van, Ryuka, and their companions arrive expecting a peaceful celebration after the exhausting stampede. OCC designed the sand, water, and climate to imitate a real coast. While Van and Ryuka change clothes, the others spread out across the artificial shore and prepare for the vacation. Vano and the women reveal their swimsuits, drawing immediate praise from the group. Happy races toward the water while Ryuka remains behind, still nervous about appearing in front of Van. Vano realizes she has become a third wheel in the carefully planned outing. The hidden observers tell her not to interfere, because their entire goal is to leave Van and Ryuka alone together. The staff explain that they only prepared the location and atmosphere. Van and Ryuka must create any romantic progress themselves, while everyone else watches from a supposedly safe distance. Their imagination runs wild as they predict how the pair will look in swimwear. Even the more restrained monsters become excited by the possibility of seeing Ryuka and Van relaxed outside their usual roles. Happy dashes across the beach, while the observers debate how Ryuka's tail will fit through her swimsuit. The argument becomes so graphic that several companions apologize for the embarrassing spectacle. Van and Ryuka finally emerge wearing simple, practical beach clothes. Their modest choices crush the staff's dramatic expectations, though the pair themselves look comfortable and ready to enjoy the day. The spectators complain that Ryuka's covered stomach and chest waste the opportunity for fan service. Ryuka hears enough of the criticism to wonder why anyone expected her to dress for their entertainment. Happy defends the wholesome outfits, while the others insist a swimsuit should expose far more skin. Their shameless expressions make it obvious why Van and Ryuka chose conservative clothing. Vano produces a skimpy bikini that would slip off easily, but the others silence and bury her before she can hand it to Ryuka. Van and Ryuka are told to ignore the chaos and enjoy the beach. Van explores the water and discovers that OCC filled it with realistic sea life, including poisonous fish, jellyfish, and blue-ringed octopuses. The artificial paradise is far more dangerous than advertised. A new visitor reaches the dungeon while the others are distracted. Spica, the true-eyed hero and one of Kara's 7 royal heroes, arrives at the wormhole under secret orders. Spica cuts through the outer defenses with precise sword strikes. Unlike Prominence's direct assault, she advances silently, using her special sight to read traps and weaknesses before the guards can react. Spica defeats the outer guardian and mocks the wormhole's defenses. She has been ordered to let no one escape her notice, not even another royal hero, and intends to complete the infiltration alone. Although Spica is considered the weakest of the 7 royal heroes, she takes pride in her unique sight. She enters the dungeon confident that information, not brute force, will decide the mission. Spica's eyes of truth expose magical structures and hidden mechanisms that ordinary scouts cannot detect. Kefide sent her to verify Prominence's report and uncover every secret inside the wormhole. Her serious infiltration collapses when she reaches the artificial beach and sees Ryuka in swimwear. Overwhelmed by the unexpected sight, Spica drops to her knees while the others mistake her reaction for stomach pain. Spica stares at the beach filled with boys and girls in swimsuits, unable to process how peaceful the feared dungeon appears. The supposed enemy stronghold looks more like a private summer festival. Before Spica can retreat or resume spying, the women pull her into the group. Her royal hero disguise offers no protection against Happy's determination to include every visitor in the beach activities. They explain beach volleyball, where teams of 2 keep the ball above the sand and score by forcing it into the opposing court. Spica is dragged from reconnaissance into learning the rules. The staff become excited about close-up shots of girls in swimsuits and begin treating the game like entertainment. Spica realizes the dungeon's greatest danger may be its complete lack of restraint. Spica is given a suitable swimsuit and placed near the court. A hero who entered expecting traps now finds herself studying beach etiquette from a book and preparing to play volleyball. Vano, who had collapsed from excitement after seeing Ryuka in a bikini, recovers just in time for the match. Her earlier behavior earns a punishment that Happy plans to reveal after the game. The teams are set. Vano and Gu face Ryuka and Van, with Happy serving as referee. Her suspicious smile convinces everyone that the losing pair will suffer something far worse than simple defeat. The opening serve comes fast, and Van dives to keep the ball alive. Ryuka moves beside him without hesitation, their childhood coordination immediately giving the pair an advantage. Ryuka drives a powerful spike across the net, but Vano and Gu manage to return it. The casual beach game becomes a genuine contest as both sides refuse to surrender a single point. Vino reveals that she and Happy designed the punishment before the match. She challenges Ryuka with full confidence, determined to prove that the Poison Dragon Princess remains a worthy rival. The rally accelerates until every player is diving, blocking, and striking at full strength. Sand erupts around the court while Happy cheers for the chaos she created. Even the poison-filled ball survives the violent exchanges because OCC reinforced it with adamantite-like resilience. Vino grudgingly praises Gu for being useful enough to keep their team alive. The match swings back and forth until Vano and Gu finally reach match point. One more successful attack will defeat Van and Ryuka and trigger the secret punishment. Ryuka enters beast mode rather than accept defeat, returning the ball with frightening force. Van reacts instantly, and the pair stay in the match despite standing only 1 point from losing. Before the final rally can continue, a massive shadow moves through the water toward the beach. Since the floor was supposed to be private, everyone realizes an uninvited monster has entered the area. A gigantic sea beast erupts from the artificial ocean and roars over the court. Even the dungeon residents are shocked, because OCC never stocked the beach with anything of that size. Van steps between the sea monster and the beach, furious that their special day has been interrupted. He draws Aestar and tells everyone else to protect the swimmers while he draws the creature's attention. Ryuka and Vano restrain the monster's rapidly regenerating tentacles as Van searches for its core. Every severed limb grows back, forcing the dragons to keep the creature pinned rather than simply tear it apart. The monster tries to retreat into the water, but the entire beach group surrounds it. Gu blocks the shore while Van and Ryuka close in for a coordinated finishing attack. Happy realizes the creature resembles an enormous watermelon and hands Van a wooden smashing stick. The absurd weapon seems useless until Van notices that the monster's shell reacts to the beach game's rules. Van strikes the creature's exposed center with perfect timing. Star redirects the force through the shell, cracking the giant mana monster from within. The final blow launches Van through the spray as the monster collapses. Ryuka rushes forward to catch him before he crashes into the sand. Van lands directly against Ryuka, and the rescue becomes an embarrassingly intimate embrace. Both freeze while the spectators stare at the accidental contact they had been hoping to witness all day. Vino celebrates because the accident produced exactly the romantic moment she wanted. Ryuka insists the contact was unavoidable, but her face reveals how badly the situation has shaken her. Once they separate, Van quietly tells Ryuka that her swimsuit looks good on her. The sincere compliment leaves her more flustered than the collision itself. Van returns to the remains and finishes the creature with a massive watermelon-smashing slash. The attack splits the mana core and ends the threat before it can regenerate again. Ryuka cannot explain how such a powerful mana monster appeared so deep inside a protected floor. She decides to investigate after the beach trip, while Vano insists they still finish the interrupted volleyball match. Vano and Gu concede the game after exhausting themselves in the battle. Ryuka accepts the victory but needs a moment to recover from both the monster attack and Van's unexpected compliment. Spica uses the confusion to leave the beach and continue her mission. The deeper she travels, the more her eyes of truth sense that the wormhole operates unlike any ordinary dungeon. She is stunned that Van defeated the giant mana monster without obvious magical blessings. Protective barriers created by OCC and the dungeon's former mistress also complicate her attempts to read the lower floors. Spica concludes that Van's Sirius may stand on the same level as Prominence, yet his body releases almost no detectable mana. The contradiction makes him more dangerous than the heroes described in official reports. Beyond the combat floors, Spica discovers residential districts, agriculture, infrastructure, workshops, and entertainment areas. The feared monster stronghold is organized like an advanced underground nation. Many systems are more sophisticated than those in surface cities. Spica had expected primitive lairs, but the wormhole supports a stable society with services built for thousands of residents. She realizes Ryuka's executive members are not the dungeon's only threat. Skilled technicians, craftsmen, and ordinary monsters keep every floor functioning, with a level of coordination rare even among kingdoms. Spica notices that Ryuka personally supplies enough energy to sustain the dungeon, making the usual collection of mana from adventurers unnecessary. She begins questioning why the wormhole still follows traditional dungeon customs. The evidence leads Spica to a frightening conclusion. Ryuka's true power may exceed both Van and the great hero. If the prophecy is correct, the kingdom has badly underestimated the Dark Dragon Lord. Spica remembers the prophecy claiming Ryuka will eventually transform into the Archfiend and destroy the world. Before she can dismiss the warning, an enormous mass of residual mana rises in front of her. More mana monsters gather from the dungeon's excess energy. Unlike mindless creatures elsewhere, the ones born inside the wormhole are larger, stronger, and disturbingly numerous. Spica cuts through the first wave, but the creatures begin speaking her name. Their awareness proves that something intelligent is using the mana bodies to observe the true-eyed hero. A mouth forms within the darkness and tells Spica that she is not the one it seeks. The unseen presence ignores her royal title, treating the hero as an irrelevant visitor. Spica activates her eyes of truth and destroys the surrounding bodies before they can close in. Even after the monsters vanish, she cannot identify the consciousness that spoke through them. The hidden entity turns its attention elsewhere and asks which person will become the hero it seeks. Van, Ryuka, and Spica are unknowingly drawn into a selection whose purpose remains completely unknown. Back at the beach, the group ends the day with a test of courage inside a dark cave. Everyone enters in small teams and tries to frighten the others with stories and hidden surprises. Van begins with a tale from his teenage years, but his calm delivery fails to scare anyone. The listeners complain that events he survived personally sound more adventurous than horrifying. The group moves deeper into the cave while Van describes people entering darkness without knowing what waits ahead. The narrow passage and echoing water make every step feel more dangerous. Gord takes over with a legend about a young couple who promised to remain together forever. The others listen closely, expecting the romance to end in a violent supernatural tragedy. Instead, the tale becomes a melodrama about a wealthy playboy stealing the young man's sweetheart. Happy protests that heartbreak is not the kind of monster story she came to hear. The group argues over what counts as horror. Van admits that he judges fear by whether he can defeat the threat, and the others tell him that combat strength is a terrible standard for scary stories. Vano attempts an elaborate tale involving curses, blood, apocalypse, and a suspicious cottage. Her confusing plot destroys the intimate mood she hoped would bring Van and Ryuka closer. Mino interrupts with an unnecessary steamy scene, insisting every good horror story needs one. Ryuka immediately strikes him and warns everyone not to turn the test of courage into another indecent performance. Once the others move ahead, Van and Ryuka walk together and agree to visit a real beach someday. Despite the monster attack, both admit that the artificial trip was still worth experiencing. Ryuka complains that her team would have won the volleyball match if the mana monster had not interfered. Van asks whether she remembers what he said after catching her on the beach. He repeats that the swimsuit looked good on her and that she looked cute. Ryuka expected teasing, but the direct compliment is sincere enough to leave her speechless. Ryuka hits Van for delivering the words without visible embarrassment. Van explains that it was his first time seeing a friend in a swimsuit, and admits he did not know how he was supposed to react. Van confesses that he has been suppressing his expression because he feels just as embarrassed as Ryuka. She demands that he stop hiding and show the genuine reaction on his face. Van finally lets the composure fall, revealing a shy smile and a deep blush. Ryuka sees the honest effect she had on him, and the quiet moments says more than their earlier teasing ever could. Van's face turns unmistakably red once he stops hiding his feelings. Ryuka stares in surprise, finally seeing that her appearance affected him far more than his calm voice suggested. Ryuka asks whether he is satisfied, now that she has forced out an honest reaction. Van tries to recover, but her pleased expression shows that the embarrassment was exactly what she wanted to see. Her heartbeat quickens as the meaning of Van's blush settles in. For the first time, Ryuka seriously wonders whether her feelings for him have already moved beyond childhood friendship. A sudden disturbance breaks the silence before either can say more. Even the normally noisy spectators remain stunned by the tension, while Van and Ryuka pretend the warmth in their faces came from the cave. The beach trip ends after an exhausting day of battles, games, and awkward revelations. That night, the group finally sleeps, unaware that Spica has already carried dangerous information back toward the capital. Vano and the others rest together while the dungeon grows quiet. The PCC contrasts with the royal investigations, now closing around Ryuka and Van. In the capital, Prominence and Electra wait for Spica's return from the wormhole. Her report will determine whether the 7 royal heroes prepare diplomacy or a full assault. Electra refuses Prominence's suggestion that she remain behind if the mission becomes dangerous. She chose to stand beside him and will not let fear separate them when the kingdom needs an answer. Her resolve reassures Prominence, and the two share a quiet moment before the hearing. Their growing bond gives the great hero support he never had when carrying the title alone. Spica finally returns and interrupts them, loudly insisting that romantic experience does not define a hero. After the awkward entrance, she asks to discuss an urgent discovery about the Archfiend. Spica reviews the historical cycle. A hero defeats each Archfiend, bringing a brief period of peace before another calamity appears. She suspects the relationship between the two forces is more direct than the court believes. Every new Archfiend has been stronger than the last, while heroes have also multiplied and awakened greater powers. Prominence now stands as the strongest hero in history, matching the latest escalation. Prominence fears that his own strength may cause an even more powerful Archfiend to emerge. The idea places unbearable guilt on him, as though saving the world today only guarantees a worse disaster tomorrow. Spica forces the discussion forward by revealing evidence gathered beneath the wormhole. Her report challenges the official prophecy and suggests that the royal heroes themselves may be part of the cycle. A mana monster suddenly attacks the capital, and Prominence rushes to stop it. Spica uses the commotion to reach the upper chamber and deliver the most sensitive part of her report without interference. Spica is still wounded from the wormhole and nearly collapses after forcing her body upstairs. She curses the mistake, knowing that one careless step during an infiltration could have killed her. The court treats her injuries while warning her to move more carefully. Spica insists on finishing the dungeon report, because the facts she discovered are more dangerous than the wounds. She describes Van's childhood habit of training on the mountain and descending into the wormhole. Prominence confirms that Van repeatedly challenged dangers no ordinary village child would approach. Month after month, Van returned injured from those journeys, only to prepare for another visit to Ryuka. He treated the dangerous trip as nothing more than going to a friend's home. Van's idea of normal friendship included secret dungeon exploration, absurd stories, and games with monsters. Spica concludes that his bond with Ryuka was built long before politics labeled them enemies. The royal leaders debate whether fighting the wormhole is necessary at all. Since Van and the monsters have shown restraint, cooperation may prevent the archfiend's return more safely than war. Kefide agrees that peaceful coordination would be ideal, but he still orders preparations in case Ryuka refuses. Prominence must decide whether he can lead an operation against his own childhood friends. The 7 royal heroes divide their roles. Kefide will direct the operation, while Saturn, Myojo, Rigel, and the others receive assignments based on their blessings and combat specialties. Kefide warns that every executive board member may equal an archifiend vessel in strength. To move quickly, each hero will bring only one trusted companion and leave the remaining forces on standby. The greatest problem is Van, whose power could stop the entire assault. Kefide calls upon Marussia, the Western hero who once united humans, orcs, elves, and ogres, before defeating the previous archfiend. Marussia enters with heroic confidence, only for her stomach to growl loudly before the court. The legendary savior's first concern is whether the meeting will include food, known as the hungry hero. Marussia accepts the mission while searching for something to eat. Her casual behavior makes it difficult to reconcile her with the warrior celebrated across the Western nations. When she learns Van and Ryuka are childhood friends, Marussia bitterly declares childhood friends to be scum. Her hostility comes from romantic frustration rather than any strategic judgment. Marussia complains that defeating an archfiend never made her popular, and that she still has no partner. The court cannot decide whether her honesty is refreshing or completely unreliable. Despite the complaints, Marussia promises to monitor Van and protect the kingdom. She asks the others to save food for her, then prepares to join an operation she still suspects may be a terrible idea. Inside the wormhole, Ryuka confirms that Spica infiltrated the dungeon during the beach trip. She warns that Prominence and the other royal heroes may use the information to launch a coordinated invasion. While defense plans begin, Ryuka struggles with a different crisis. The feelings awakened during her private conversation with Van. Every memory from the beach now returns with embarrassing clarity. The staff explain the 7 royal heroes and compare their divine blessings to the strength of Gord and the executive members. The coming enemies include specialists in stealth, agriculture, wind, rain, and direct combat. The strategic meeting derails when Ryuka accidentally admits that something meaningful happened between her and Van. The romance-obsessed staff react more violently to that confession than to the threat of invasion. Ryuka reluctantly recounts Van's compliment, his blush, and the moment she realized her own feelings. She can barely finish the story while the others celebrate the progress they have waited years to see. Her advisors insist that accepting those feelings is only the first step. They claim their constant observation has given them enough experience to guide Ryuka toward an eventual confession. The group proposes simple ways to grow closer, beginning with ordinary greetings and time together. When someone suggests confessing immediately, the others agree that rushing could damage the friendship. They fear that a failed confession might leave Van and Ryuka painfully awkward around each other. Several staff members selfishly want to preserve the precious stage where the pair are more than friends, but not yet lovers. The advice becomes a complicated lecture about misunderstanding, restraint, dependence, and rebuilding trust. Ryuka extracts one useful lesson: honest relationships deepen by surviving change rather than avoiding it forever. After listening to every argument, Ryuka announces that she will not confess yet. The staff are stunned that their elaborate guidance led her to the exact opposite conclusion. Ryuka argues that she and Van will probably end up together naturally. but the staff warn that waiting forever gives another woman time to take him. The thought immediately destroys her calm. She imagines several confession strategies, from casual weather talk to blurting out that she loves him. Every version ends in panic, because the other's advice has filled her head with impossible expectations. Van arrives before Ryuka can settle on a plan and asks what she wanted to discuss. She nearly confesses on the spot, then freezes when his relaxed smile makes the situation suddenly real. The hidden staff delight in watching Ryuka become flustered now that she understands her feelings. They have waited years for this change, and treat every nervous pause as precious progress. Ryuka loses her nerve, screams and bolts away, before Van can understand what happened. He is left surrounded by suspicious spectators who refuse to explain why their boss fled from a simple conversation. Van resumes his secret work as Pan on the first floor, where an ordinary shift turns into an argument over what qualities define a true goblin. During lunch, the first-floor monsters invite Pan to join them in the cafeteria. Van now spends so much time working in armor that many residents see him as a monster employee rather than an adventurer. Cobb's son Hob returns after years of training in other dungeons. He claims the experience expanded his horizons and proudly announces that he has become stronger than the goblins who raised him. Hob criticizes Cobb's policy of sparing adventurers and using intimidation instead of killing. He calls the veterans weak, promises to become the family's breadwinner, and tells his father to retire. Pan rejects the insult and challenges Hob to return the next day. He promises to demonstrate what a true goblin actually is, even though he has no clear definition yet. Van asks the four idiots to help him understand the ultimate goblin. They simulate combat, work, and daily life, searching for the qualities that made Cobb and the first-floor veterans so effective. The contest expands beyond fighting into tasks representing every part of dungeon life. Other monster species gather to watch Pan and Hob prove who understands goblin strength more completely. Pan and Hob face each other before Cobb and the judges. Cobb refuses to miss a battle involving his son and the strange armored worker who defended the veteran's honor. The first trial is cooking, because dungeon survival requires feeding allies as much as defeating enemies. Hob mocks the task until he learns that remote floors often depend on fighters who can prepare meals. Both competitors swear to win. Pan fights for Cobb and the others, while Hob refuses to lose at anything after boasting that foreign dungeons taught him every necessary skill. Hob serves grilled meat using techniques learned abroad. The judges praise the rich flavor and char, impressed that his years away truly gave him practical experience. The ingredients are high quality, and Hob's dish shows careful control of heat and seasoning. Even Pan admits the returning goblin has earned his confidence rather than merely pretending. Pan's meal tastes even richer, because every ingredient was selected for the people eating it. The judges recognize that he considered needs, allowing individual flavors to support one another instead of competing. The lesson becomes clear. True goblins survive by adapting to whatever adventurers or circumstances place before them. Strength matters, but flexibility, teamwork, and concern for the group matter more. Hob admits he believed raw power was everything. Cobb invites him to remain on floor 1 and relearn the goblin way, turning the challenge into the beginning of his return home. The contest ends with Hob accepting Pan's lessons and shaking his hand. The first-floor goblins welcome him home, believing the strange armored worker has restored respect between father and son. Hob suddenly decides that anyone who defended his family deserves a face-to-face introduction. Before Pan can stop him, he reaches for the helmet and demands to see who has been hiding inside. The helmet is knocked away in front of the entire floor. Cobb and the others stare in horror as Pan's supposed monster identity disappears with a single careless movement. Van stands exposed beneath the armor, leaving goblins and dungeon workers speechless. The secret adventurer who had lived among them as Pan can no longer pretend nothing happened. News spreads that Pan was actually the human adventurer Van Sirius. Monsters who trusted him feel shocked, while others remember that he already had close ties to Ryuka and the executive board. The rumor reaches every floor, and residents demand explanations from the bosses who kept the truth hidden. Even the abyss monsters begin asking whether Van deceived them or genuinely considered them co-workers. The staff blame one another for exposing him. Mino attacked without checking, OCC used the wrong name, and Gru ignored the registry. Van accepts responsibility for secretly taking the role and causing the confusion. Van decides to stop working openly with the monsters, fearing his presence will make everyone uncomfortable. He plans to return only in secret when visiting Ryuka, restoring the distance that existed before Pan. Ryuka refuses to accept that retreat because it is not like Van to abandon people while reading the room. She knows the job with Cobb mattered to him and resolves to make the dungeon accept the truth. The Dragon King gathers the residents of Dragon's Abyss and announces a formal response. Van has earned too much trust for the matter to be settled through rumors and silent avoidance. An emergency press conference begins before monsters from every floor. The Dragon King intends to explain Van's identity, his work as Pan, and why the dungeon leadership protected the secret. While the conference proceeds, several staff members distract themselves with a competitive board game. Ryuka prepares a card that could reverse the match if she reaches the goal first. The game, Dungeon no Osananajimi, combines dice movement, cards, merchant caravans, and battles over money and territory. Its mixture of human and monster roles makes it popular throughout the wormhole. The players promise to behave, but the match quickly becomes personal. Everyone restrains themselves only long enough to choose cards capable of ruining another player's strategy. Teleportation, debt, exile, and sabotage cards turn the board into open warfare. Winning depends less on reaching the goal than preventing every opponent from getting there first. Vino joins midway and claims she will mediate the childhood friend tension. After writing 7 romance novels, she believes no social conflict can frighten her. She immediately uses a devil card that transforms a player into a demon lord and multiplies their debt. The supposedly calming mediator becomes the most aggressive person at the table. Vino considers stealing Ryuka's resources and drawing everyone's hostility toward herself. Her otaku-inspired scheme only deepens the chaos and reveals that she entered the dungeon to manipulate the entire conflict. The others finally remember the Dragon King's sensible declaration. Van and Ryuka are not in conflict, and everyone should continue supporting them without forcing progress. The game is merely playful competition. The press conference ends, and the dungeon waits to see whether its residents will accept Van as both a human adventurer and one of their own trusted workers. Van considers returning Ryuka's borrowed book and training with Gord, only to learn that Gord and Sylvia have been summoned to the royal capital by their daughter Electra. A stranger approaches Van in the street and calmly introduces herself before raising a weapon. Her composed manner hides the fact that another royal hero has already begun the operation. Rain-shaped projectiles strike without warning, but Van twists between them and protects nearby civilians. The attacker adjusts instantly, confirming that the ambush was designed specifically for him. The battle tears across the empty street as Van closes the distance. Each time he reaches her, another precisely aimed attack forces him back without damaging the surrounding buildings. Atlas explains that her rain can target with perfect accuracy, and that the kingdom has prepared compensation for any damage. Van realizes she is one of the heroes sent to support the raid on Ryuka. More royal heroes reveal themselves around the district. Van understands that the invasion has finally begun, and that the ambush exists to keep him away from the wormhole. Van blocks another coordinated assault, but the heroes rotate attacks too quickly for him to break free. Their formation is not meant to defeat him immediately. It is designed to hold him in place. Inside the dungeon, the remaining heroes begin fighting Ryuka's defenders. Betelgeuse, Rigel, Atlas, and their allies follow Kephide's plan while Prominence waits for the signal to advance deeper. Atlas activates her divine protection, Rain, storing attacks and releasing them in a concentrated downpour. Van counters the accumulated force, yet every deflection gives the other heroes more time to invade. Marussia reaches Ryuka and declares that she has come to capture the Black Dragon vessel and prevent the Archfiend's revival. She also admits that sampling the dungeon's food is one of her personal objectives. Marussia reveals that she and her old party members have separated and reunited repeatedly since defeating the previous Archfiend. Her anger toward childhood friends comes from years of unresolved relationship problems. Ryuka proudly answers that her childhood friends are kind, dependable, and fun. The sincere declaration causes Marussia mysterious emotional damage, since it highlights everything missing from her own complicated bond. Van endures another heavy pressure slash from Atlas and forces his way toward the dungeon. The royal heroes tighten their formation, knowing a single opening will let him escape. Atlas unleashes a stored storm of strikes, but Van redirects the barrage away from the city. His control prevents casualties, while proving that the heroes cannot rely on overwhelming him with volume alone. When the smoke clears, Van finds several royal heroes surrounding him at once. Their combined blessings create overlapping threats that would crush an ordinary adventurer instantly. The heroes explain that Prominence told them about Van and warned them not to underestimate his power. Divine protections over strength, wind, rain, and perception are all focused on preventing him from reaching Ryuka. Elektra once described these heroes as Prominence's trusted comrades. Atlas and Beetlejuice treated her as a normal friend, Saturn helped with plants, and Myojo shared disciplined sword training. She also praised Marussia as a supportive older sister and Kayfeed as a strict but respected teacher who protected heroes from political schemes. Prominence believes every member is important to him. Van realizes his opponents are not cruel people seeking glory. They are fighting because they believe the world's survival depends on stopping Ryuka, which makes the conflict harder to resolve. Even so, Van refuses to stand aside. Whether the heroes are good people or acting to protect the world, he will not let them kill Ryuka without proving that no other solution exists. Van's expression turns cold as he draws a firm line. Anyone who harms his childhood friends will receive no mercy. Even the heroes, who believed they understood his strength, realize they have pushed him into a far more dangerous state. Looking above the city, Van notices that Atlas has been quietly gathering mana in the sky throughout the battle. The enormous mass hanging overhead confirms that the heroes have been preparing a coordinated finishing move rather than attacking him at random. Atlas and Beetlejuice rush Van together, shouting for him to prepare himself. Their aggressive charge finally draws a grin from Van, who welcomes the chance to answer their determination with his own full strength. Their attacks collide above the town in a violent explosion. The heroes compare the barrage to being caught between cannons, while nearby allies panic over the damage such power could cause in the middle of a populated city. Realizing the town cannot withstand a serious battle, Prominence proposes moving outside the walls. He points to a vast wasteland where both sides can unleash everything without endangering civilians, and Van accepts the change of location. The heroes admit they had hoped to restrain Van inside the town, but the risk to innocent people makes that impossible. Van agrees without argument, proving that despite his anger, he has no intention of sacrificing bystanders for victory. Once they reach open ground, Van answers the heroes with a racing slash. A colossal blade of force tears across the wasteland, forcing the entire group to scatter before the sweeping attack can erase them along with the landscape. Prominence blocks the strike and explains the source of his endurance. His divine protection, Sun Reactor, continuously produces mana and becomes dramatically stronger under direct sunlight. Van immediately understands why Prominence can keep fighting at this intensity. Rather than retreat, Van declares that he will now fight without holding back. Prominence urges him to begin quickly, and Van gathers his power into the sword as both men prepare for their decisive exchange. Van unleashes relentless extreme slashing attack, flooding the wasteland with countless intersecting blades. Prominence is swallowed by the storm of cuts, yet continues forcing his way forward through an assault that would have destroyed an ordinary opponent instantly. The force of the distant battle reaches Wormhole and makes the entire dungeon tremble. Ryuka and the residents look around in alarm, quickly realizing that the shaking is not a natural disturbance, but the result of overwhelming power nearby. Kafid questions the earlier report claiming Van possessed no mana. After witnessing him personally, he can no longer accept that conclusion. Van and the heroes may all appear abnormal, but Van stands on an entirely different level. Kefid explains that ordinary people release mana from the body as life energy, then use it to reinforce themselves or cast magic. Van's mana, however, shows no waste or fluctuation, as though every trace remains perfectly aligned within him. Van circulates mana through his bones, blood, muscles, nerves, organs, and every other tissue with almost impossible precision. By eliminating every discrepancy, he continuously strengthens his body to an extreme degree, revealing the true foundation of his absurd physical power. The others understand the explanation, though some complain that reducing Van's strength to theory ruins its mystery. In the end, Kephide's detailed analysis changes nothing about the conclusion everyone already shared. Van is simply terrifyingly powerful. Knowing Van's secret does not give the heroes an easy answer. Prominence is currently the only one capable of facing him directly, so the others decide to deploy the trump card they prepared specifically to interfere with Van's mana. Prominence drives through Van's barrage and closes the distance with a heavy strike. Van blocks at the last instant, but the force sends both fighters sliding across the shattered ground as neither gains a clean advantage. The exchange accelerates into a blur of sword swings, punches, and explosive impacts. Prominence keeps pressing with the endless mana of Sun Reactor, while Van answers every attack with precise counters and overwhelming physical strength. Their weapons meet again at point-blank range, locking the two men face to face. Van reads Prominence's next movement, while the hero forces more power into his blade, each refusing to yield even a single step. After fighting Van at full intensity, Prominence admits that the boy is exactly as formidable as expected. Van, equally impressed, recognizes that the hero has grown far stronger, and their mutual respect only makes the duel more dangerous. The duel ends without a clear winner, but the heroes refuse to surrender their mission. While civilians are evacuated from the damaged area, Prominence admits that strength alone will not settle the conflict between Van and the royal heroes. Prominence remembers leaving his village because he wanted to become strong like Van, the person he admired most. Yet, receiving overwhelming power by chance left him wondering whether he had truly earned the right to call himself a hero. Instead of drowning in doubt, Prominence chose to use the power he had been given. No matter how painful the burden became, he kept smiling and committed himself to protecting others as the great hero. Van refuses to let Prominence kill Ryuka, but Prominence reveals that the heroes have another plan. They do not intend to destroy her immediately. First, they need to defeat her once and confirm what is actually happening. Prominence rejects the choice between saving the world and saving Ryuka. If both are placed on opposite sides of a scale, he intends to break the scale itself, stop the Demon Lord's revival, and protect everyone with his own power. Van calls the idea absurd, then realizes it perfectly matches the friend he remembers. Prominence is not someone who could calmly choose between his companions and the world, and Van admits that he feels exactly the same way. Prominence has already defeated many people identified as potential vessels for the Demon Lord. Even so, he refuses to abandon the prophecy simply because the latest vessel is Ryuka, insisting that such carelessness would endanger countless lives. Van answers that he understands, because he has always admired Prominence's determination. That honest respect breaks through the hostility for a moment, reminding both men that they are childhood friends before they are opponents. Van tells Prominence not to belittle himself or compare their strength. His kindness was never weakness. It was the quality Van respected most, and the reason Prominence became the kind of hero Van could trust. Prominence lowers his weapon and admits that he does not want to keep fighting Van. Then he reveals the secret behind the entire mission. He has been hiding crucial information about the Demon Lord from everyone. Before Prominence can finish, a violent force erupts through his body. Van freezes as his friend's posture changes, realizing that something has interrupted the confession and seized control at the worst possible moment. Prominence begins laughing uncontrollably, while his body twists under an unseen influence. Van calls his name, but the expression facing him no longer belongs to the gentle childhood friend who had just lowered his sword. The presence inside Prominence mocks him for trusting Van and sneers at the idea of protecting both the world and Ryuka. It promises to torture the dragon slowly, using Prominence's own mouth to threaten the person he most wanted to save. Trapped inside his own body, Prominence realizes that his limbs and voice are moving without permission. Van recognizes the struggle immediately and addresses the invader directly, enraged that it has taken control of his childhood friend. The possessing entity attacks Van through Prominence's body, gleefully declaring that it intends to kill him. Prominence fights from within, but every movement turns his heroic strength into a weapon aimed at the friend he wanted to protect. Van searches for the source of the possession, but cannot see any separate creature or spell around Prominence. The enemy is concealed inside him, using his mana and body so completely that ordinary detection reveals nothing. A fresh collision tears apart the ground as Van tests the possessed hero's movements. The strange mana surrounding Prominence behaves unlike his normal power, giving Van the first clue that the invader is hiding within the flow itself. When the entity lunges again, Van abandons swordplay and uses a martial technique to bind Prominence's arm. By controlling the joint instead of striking his body, Van restrains his friend without causing unnecessary injury. The invader floods Prominence with burning mana and taunts Van to attack. Van refuses to be manipulated, endures the assault, and focuses on separating the hostile presence from the friend still resisting beneath it. Van exposes the deception immediately. Prominence had already decided to sacrifice himself before revealing the truth. Calling the dramatic performance unconvincing, Van refuses to accept any plan that saves Ruka by throwing away his childhood friend's life. Van identifies the possession as a mass of hostile mana controlling Prominence from within. He tells his friend to hold the invader in one place for a single instant, promising to strike only the parasite and spare Prominence's body. There is no time for a detailed explanation, so Van asks Prominence to trust him and follow the plan. Remembering the people he wants to protect, Prominence forces a smile and prepares to restrain the creature from inside. Prominence seizes control for one brief opening and shouts that he is ready. Van immediately drives forward, concentrating his power into a precise blow aimed at the mana occupying his friend's body. The entity desperately fights for control, but Prominence pins it down with sheer will. Van closes the final distance while the hero endures the backlash, turning their childhood bond into the opening needed to defeat the hidden enemy. Van delivers the finishing strike without hesitation. The impact erupts through Prominence's body and tears the possessing mana apart, while Prominence keeps himself steady long enough to prevent the attack from missing its target. The blast leaves a vast crater across the wasteland. Van remains standing at its center, injured but conscious, while Prominence collapses after exhausting every trace of strength resisting the entity. Before Van can check on him, enchanted chains shoot across the crater and wrap tightly around Van's arms and torso. The heroes activate their prepared trump card, taking advantage of the instant after his battle with Prominence. Kephide approaches while the chains continue draining Van's mana. He asks Van to remain calm and listen while he can still speak, insisting that the restraint is meant to prevent another fight rather than execute him. Van and Prominence had joined forces to destroy the mysterious will manipulating the hero and targeting Ryuka. Prominence resisted from within, giving Van the opening to defeat it, but the royal heroes captured Van immediately afterward. The heroes confirm that Prominence is alive and merely unconscious. Even Van's tremendous strength cannot break the magic tool restraining him, leaving him helpless, while the group decides what to do next. Kephide identifies the restraint as the evil sealing chain, an artifact once used by a heretical cult to imprison an evil god. It drains the target's mana and gradually seals the body inside crystal until only enough energy remains to sustain life. Van realizes the chain was originally prepared for Ryuka and angrily calls Kephide a pervert for using such a device on him. Kephide dismisses the insult, stating that the failure of their first plan forced them to adapt, because the original artifact was too useful to discard. Kephide had a magic tool guild analyze it and create a duplicate. The heroes therefore possess enough restraints to imprison both Van and Ryuka if necessary. Kephide insists that the heroes have no intention of killing either childhood friend. The sealing is temporary. While Van and Ryuka are restrained, the royal faction plans to investigate the true cause of the Demon Lord's predicted rebirth. Van cannot accept a solution that locks Ryuka away even more completely than she already is. As the chain begins stealing his voice and consciousness, he struggles against the crystal forming around his body. One hero suddenly wonders whether the possessing will change hosts when Van touched Prominence. The possibility alarms Kephide, because capturing Van may have placed the hidden enemy inside the very person they are trying to restrain. Kephide orders Prominence taken to the town for treatment and commands the guards to imprison Van until the operation ends. Van is dragged away despite his protests, while the healers rush to stabilize the exhausted hero. Pinned beneath the guards, Van calls Ryuka's name and swears he will still reach her. Meanwhile, the residents of Wormhole study the distant battle through their monitoring equipment. Ryuka's staff realize the violent shaking came from Van's clash with the royal heroes. Expecting the attackers to reach the dungeon next, they order every resident to evacuate and prepare the remaining defenders for an invasion. Even during the emergency, Happy reveals an absurd plan meant to give Ryuka a chance to confess her feelings to Van. The other women reject the so-called slippery sumo operation immediately, leaving Ryuka mortified while the evacuation continues. Ryuka's companions tell her to stay behind and prepare to welcome Van home, while they deal with the approaching heroes. Even during the crisis, they insist that Ryuka must believe he will return and continue the life they built together. The defenders reveal that they have studied the royal hero's abilities and trained specifically for this invasion. Several boast about new forms and future celebrations, piling cheerful promises onto the battle before it has even begun. One resident panics and accuses everyone of raising death flags with their confident speeches. The others mock the warning as something learned from too many novels, only to make even more ominous promises moments later. Harpy grows increasingly anxious over the farewell-like atmosphere and calls out every suspicious phrase. Her companions insist they are strong enough to survive, but their attempts to reassure her only sound like more signs of impending disaster. The royal heroes enter Wormhole without prominence, making even their own members uneasy. Kefai-id's calm decision to proceed suggests that he has prepared a method capable of disabling the dungeon before Ryuka's forces can exploit their home field advantage. Kefid activates Null, creating a wide cylindrical field around himself. The blessing suppresses supernatural protections within its range, instantly stripping both heroes and monsters of the powers they normally rely on. Because Null would also disable his allies, Kefid coordinates its range carefully, while Rigel manipulates the air with wind control. Their true target is the ether-filling wormhole, the magical gas that keeps the dungeon's ecosystem functioning. Once the ether loses its magical properties, it becomes ordinary gas and the dungeon rapidly runs out of oxygen. Emergency ventilation begins, but the entire wormhole starts shutting down while residents collapse from suffocation. The heroes race toward the lowest floor and ignore the monsters falling around them, following the cruel plan they accepted. A skeletal defender who needs no air attacks with cultivation, buying time while the others search for Ryuka. Several dungeon residents keep fighting despite the oxygen loss, but even confident warriors begin to weaken. They know the non-combatants will die first, so every surviving defender focuses on delaying the heroes rather than winning outright. Ryuka pours her own power into the dungeon and restores the monsters hovering near death. As thousands begin breathing again, the defenders use the brief recovery to evacuate everyone toward the surface. The royal heroes watch Ryuka heal thousands of residents by herself and finally understand her potential. Her enormous output confirms why the prophecy identifies her as a possible demon lord vessel, but it also leaves her dangerously exhausted. Kefid orders the assault team toward the lowest floor, while Ryuka is using most of her strength to sustain the dungeon. With 4 suspected vessels gathered nearby, he believes this is the only chance to seal her before she recovers. Ryuka's strongest monsters assemble between the heroes and their master. Across the chamber, the royal assault team forms its own line, turning the lowest floor into the final battlefield between 2 groups determined to protect the world in different ways. Ryuka refuses to collapse while Van remains captured. She has not even confessed how she feels, and that unfinished promise gives her enough strength to rise again and beg him to return safely. The heroes break through the last defensive formation with a massive combined attack. Stone walls explode, monsters are thrown aside, and the route to Ryuka opens as the remaining guards struggle to stay conscious. Ryuka's companions throw themselves in front of her and order Kefid to stop. Ignoring their resistance, he raises the evil sealing chain and formally declares that Ryuka will be imprisoned as the Black Dragon King. Before Kefid can complete the seal, his arm moves against his will. The hidden entity that escaped prominence has taken control of him, forcing the hero to turn the chain and weapon toward Ryuka without understanding his own actions. Kefid begs his body to stop as the possessed hand drives his blade forward. Ryuka's defenders shout for her to move, but the attack is already descending through the confusion created by the entity's sudden takeover. Harpy leaps between Ryuka and the blade, taking the strike through her body. Ryuka catches her wounded companion in horror, while Kifid stares at the blood on his weapon, fully aware that something else used him to attack. Ryuka catches Harpy before she falls and stares at the wound in disbelief. Harpy weakly calls her name, while the other defenders rush forward, knowing that their injured companion cannot survive without immediate healing. Ryuka places her hands over Harpy and begins restoring the damaged body at once. Her panic drives even more power into the spell, but the intense mana pouring from her also gives the hidden entity the opening it has been waiting for. A violent surge erupts from Ryuka and shakes the lowest floor. Her scream cuts through the chamber as black mana wraps around her body, forcing everyone nearby to retreat from the transformation beginning before them. The dungeon's monsters flee as Ryuka's powers burst beyond control. Horns, wings, and a terrifying aura emerge through the storm, revealing that the attack on Harpy has triggered the awakening the heroes feared. Ryuka reaches toward the wound in her own chest and suddenly smiles with an expression that is not hers. The will controlling the crisis has finally entered its intended vessel and begins moving the newly awakened body. The entity explains that Ryuka's transformation had nearly completed 10 years earlier. Her mother recognized the danger and sealed her inside Wormhole, using the dungeon to block both the awakening and the entity's control until now. With the seal broken and Ryuka's emotions pushed past their limit, the will declares her the final demon lord. A vast shadow rises behind the awakened dragon as the prophecy begins taking physical form. Ryuka emerges in her complete demon lord form, surrounded by wings and crushing mana. Her familiar face remains, but the calm smile and commanding posture reveal that another consciousness is now speaking through her. The possessed Ryuka identifies herself as the Will of Mana, the force that controlled Prominence and then Kefade. By moving between hosts, it manipulated both the heroes and the dungeon until Ryuka's awakening became unavoidable. The Will of Mana praises Kefade's Null for disabling the dungeon and the stab wound for forcing Ryuka past her limit. With the vessel awakened, only the final phase of its plan remains, turning her power against the world. Ryuka's companions reject the declaration and loudly insist that possession still counts as stealing another person's beloved. Their ridiculous argument cannot hide their resolve. None of them intends to surrender Ryuka to the intruder controlling her. The women claim that what Ryuka truly needs is Van's embrace, not the Will of Mana's commands. They call for him to arrive quickly, convinced that the childhood friend she loves can pull her back from the possession. The Will of Mana decides that everyone on the lowest floor has become unnecessary. With a single release of power, it tears through the chamber and begins removing Ryuka's defenders before they can reach her. Even under threat, the women keep arguing over how Ryuka should greet Van and how much skin she should show. Their shameless planning enrages the entity, but it also proves that fear has not broken their loyalty to Ryuka. When ordered to flee, the defenders refuse to abandon their dragon queen. They would rather be struck down beside Ryuka than leave her alone inside an enemy's control, and their stubborn resistance delays the Will of Mana again. The possessed Ryuka turns her attention to the upper floors and unleashes a column of destructive power. The blast tears upward through Wormhole, clearing away the remaining obstacles between her and the surface. Outside the dungeon, the heroes witness the enormous eruption and sense Ryuka's transformed mana. They search the ruins for survivors, fearing that the awakening may have killed everyone still trapped below. Prominence arrives with Electra and confirms that the scattered heroes are alive. After hearing what happened, he rejects the mission's original conclusion and declares that he no longer wants them to fight Ryuka. Prominence explains that Van freed him from the Will of Mana and restored his true self. Learning that the same entity moved through Kefade and into Ryuka, he realizes Van had understood the enemy before any of the royal heroes did. Van urges the heroes to reach Ryuka and help with whatever plan becomes possible. Prominence trusts that Van can save her, while the others prepare to throw all their remaining power against the Will of Mana, rather than the girl it possesses. Ryuka's companions are relieved that Prominence has returned to normal and that the wounded monsters survived. Their gratitude vanishes when they realize he did not bring the captured Van with him, and they immediately call him an idiot. Prominence accepts the insult and declares that saving Ryuka will be his first step toward becoming a true hero. He promises to surpass Van one day, then casually adds that Van and Ryuka will attend his future wedding with Elektra. Elektra realizes Prominence has effectively proposed in the middle of the emergency. While everyone shouts at him for choosing the worst possible moment, his ridiculous confidence restores some courage to the exhausted group. Heroes and dungeon residents put aside their distrust and join hands. With Van imprisoned and Ryuka possessed, both sides agree that protecting their childhood friends matters more than blame or old hostility. The crisis becomes a struggle between two roles forced onto Ryuka. The demon lord created by the will of Mana and the childhood friend Van refuses to abandon. Everyone's final hope rests on bringing the real Ryuka back. The defenders summarize their situation. The enemy's scheme awakened Ryuka as a demon lord, the heroes were deceived, and Van remains captive in the city. They divide their forces between rescuing Van and containing Ryuka near Wormhole. After confirming the wounded can move, several companions race toward the city prison where Van is being held. The others remain behind, convinced that the will of Mana is preparing another attack through Ryuka. Vanoa and her group volunteer to stay with the injured residents, while the main rescue team departs. Their decision ensures the dungeon will not be left defenseless if the possessed Ryuka returns before Van is freed. A mechanical ally suddenly reappears and explains that Kafid's null had disrupted its functions. It originally entered the dungeon to help Ryuka, but retreated after encountering too many unfamiliar fighters, and has only now returned to normal. The machine admits it mistook Ryuka's friends for useful test subjects because it could not understand the social hierarchy around her. The others realize the chaotic alliance has become almost impossible for outsiders to read. Before the misunderstanding can be resolved, hostile golem soldiers attack the dungeon residents. The machine declares itself an ally and turns its weapons on the invaders, proving its loyalty through action rather than explanation. The defenders demand to know why another force has appeared during an already impossible battle. The newcomers claim a connection to Ryuka's childhood, but their timing makes everyone suspect yet another enemy operation. The visitors explain that they came from a neighboring country and received information too late to arrive sooner. The defenders postpone the argument, focusing first on protecting Ryuka and stopping the will of Mana. A companion recognizes Minos among the arrivals and questions why fighting alongside this strange group. Minos refuses a long explanation and asks everyone to concentrate on the immediate threat. The combined defenders charge the golem soldiers, using the confusion to break through their formation. Every faction that once distrusted the others now fights toward the same objective, clearing a path to Ryuka. Elsewhere, Ryuka's mother, Reened Obsidian, senses the seal surrounding Van. She realizes the artifact crystallizing him is connected to the same plan that forced her daughter's awakening. Rind and Baham begin moving to intervene, though their companions nearly ruin the urgency with another absurd argument. Once the distraction ends, the two powerful figures head toward the imprisoned Van. At the underground prison, a visitor warns the guards that Wormhole is collapsing, and everyone may die without cooperation. Promising future dungeon loot, he convinces the reluctant prisoners and guards to help free Van. Van studies the evil sealing chain and recognizes that the crystal becomes harder to remove as time passes. He cannot break it from inside, so the rescue team must stop the artifact before the seal fully closes. Rind reaches Van's cell and asks him to open his eyes. She admits that Ryuka's family has watched over her for years without being able to save her, and now Van is the only person they believe can reach her. Van wakes and shatters the crystal around him with raw strength, shocking everyone who believed the evil sealing chain was unbreakable. After resting from the fight with Prominence, he simply tears the remaining restraints apart and asks where Ryuka is. The rescuers explain that Prominence and the others are already confronting the possessed Ryuka. Before Van leaves, Rind asks him to hear what happened 10 years earlier, promising to keep the explanation as short as possible. Learning that the will of Mana has taken Ryuka pushes Van past his remaining hesitation. He enters a focused, serious state and declares that he has been waiting to destroy the entity responsible for ruining her life. Rind begins with the day Van escorted Ryuka home after their first meeting. Though the two children had only just met, Ryuka already wanted to play with him again, and Van happily promised they would reunite. Baham Obsidian carried the children across Byakuya Mountain in a single day, amazing Van with a dragon's speed. The journey marked the beginning of Van's connection to Ryuka's family long before he understood their secret. Baham thanked Van for bringing Ryuka home safely and invited him to visit whenever he wished. Ryuka had become deeply attached to Van, and her parents even joked about preparing a room for him inside their future dungeon. Van imagined traveling with Ryuka and showing everyone her true form, though Baham warned that exposing a dragon near human settlements would cause panic. Before parting, Van invited Ryuka to visit his village as well. Instead of taking Van directly home, Baham landed in the forest below the village. He explained that Ryuka had once appeared there after a mysterious incident, and that the location held the truth behind her condition. Villagers believed Ryuka had caused the violent storm that accompanied her arrival, but Van never accepted their suspicion. Baham brought him to the exact site, because Ryuka herself could not remember what happened there. Baham asks whether Van knows the old story of the hero who defeated the demon lord in a distant land. That legendary battle, he explains, is directly connected to the power sleeping inside Ryuka. The final war took place on the western continent, where an alliance led by the hero fought the demon lord's armies. Baham and Riend belonged to the demi-human faction, supporting the battle from the rear. During the campaign, the western heroine Marcia traveled with powerful companions and eventually confronted the demon lord. Their victory ended the war, but the force behind this conflict survived beyond the battlefield. That force searched for a new vessel with exceptional potential. It found Ryuka while she was still a child, marking her as the next body capable of becoming a demon lord. Because Ryuka's body was too young to contain the power, she lost consciousness and rampaged across the land. The dormant energy carried her to the forest, near Van's village, before her parents could stop her. Baham explains that the will of mana transforms suitable vessels into either heroes or demon lords, without their knowledge. Van desperately asks whether Ryuka can still be saved from the role forced upon her. Ryuka's parents believed she would eventually awaken again and become uncontrollable. To delay that fate, they confined her inside the deepest part of Wormhole and used the dungeon to suppress her power, never allowing her to leave freely. Van rejects the idea that Ryuka must either destroy the world or be killed by a hero. He vows to defeat the will of mana himself and save her, refusing to accept a prophecy that treats his friend as disposable. Baham answers Van's confidence with a crushing blow, warning that determination alone cannot overcome such an enemy. If Van intends to challenge the force manipulating heroes and demon lords, he must prove he can survive the training ahead. Van can barely move after Baham's attack, but the dragon gives him 3 days to stand again. If he succeeds, Baham promises to teach him the method that may one day save Ryuka. The training becomes brutal enough to leave Van bedridden for weeks beneath magical restraints. Baham admits the ordeal is harsher than any normal child could endure, yet Van refuses to abandon the promise he made to Ryuka. The young Van rises after Baham's test and declares that he will save Ryuka no matter what the training demands. His refusal to stay down convinces Baham that the child may truly become their only hope. Baham brings Van deep into the Byakuya Mountains, and warns that the road ahead will be a living hell. Van accepts without hesitation, caring only about learning how to prevent Ryuka's future awakening. Baham summons a group of legendary veterans and announces a secret training camp designed to defeat the will of mana. Van immediately understands that ordinary sword practice will not be enough for the enemy waiting inside Ryuka. The instructors include an elven great sage, an orc warrior chief, and other survivors who once fought beside the western heroine, Marcia. Each agrees to train Van in the skills their old alliance used against the demon lord. Baham assigns specialists in physical combat, magical warfare, and survival, while keeping the operation secret from almost everyone. They cannot allow the will of Manas to learn that a third force is being prepared outside the hero-demon lord cycle. The instructors examine the mark placed on Van and explain that it continuously stores absorbed mana. Because the energy remains sealed inside him, the will of mana cannot easily detect or interfere with the power being accumulated. They reveal that the will of mana is a parasitic life form from outer space. It reshaped living bodies into monsters, heroes, and demon lords, then prolonged conflict, so it could harvest ever greater quantities of mana. Their plan is to raise Van as a third party belonging to neither heroes nor demon lords. After 10 years of storage, he must release all his mana into awakened Ryuka, expel the parasite with her power, and restore her normal body. The concept sounds simple, but Van must reach the level of the greatest heroes and demon lords without exposing the plan. Baham warns that the entire operation will be abandoned if Van hesitates or proves incapable of surviving it. Van accepts every condition and begins training immediately. The instructors attack from multiple directions, forcing him to improve his body, magic control, and awareness while protecting the mana stored for Ryuka. Elemental spells, thorns, beasts, and weapon strikes overwhelm Van in rapid succession. Each instructor targets a different weakness, turning the mountain into a battlefield where a single mistake could end the plan permanently. Van divides his life between months of training in the Byakuya Mountains and visits to Wormhole so Ryuka will not feel abandoned. He keeps the operation secret, never breaking the promise to return and play with her. For the first several years, Van loses every match against Baham and the other coaches. Even repeated near-death injuries cannot stop him, because failure would mean leaving Ryuka trapped inside the fate chosen for her. A decade passes through endless battles, recovery, and harsher challenges. Van grows from a determined child into a fighter capable of enduring techniques that once defeated him instantly. By the final year, Van can defeat Wormhole executives with a single attack. The same monsters who once overwhelmed him are thrown aside, proving that the secret training has pushed him beyond ordinary adventurers. The instructors refine Van's mana circulation through every muscle and nerve, correcting microscopic errors in his reactions. His ability to absorb each lesson marks him as a genius, capable of cutting through magical barriers and conceptual defenses. Van eventually defeats even the veteran coaches, though the effort repeatedly leaves him in a state close to death. The adults realize his lifeless eyes were not indifference, but the result of carrying this burden alone for years. The secret finally explains why Van has stored an enormous amount of power inside his body. His friends turn the revelation into another embarrassing joke about releasing 10 years of affection into Ryuka. But the method itself is real. Ryuka's companions ask why Van risked his life for 10 years while hiding everything from her. As the seal weakens, Van remembers the simple promise that started the entire ordeal and prepares to answer honestly. Van cannot reduce his motive to destiny or heroism. Ryuka is his childhood friend, and from the moment he saw her true form, he could not accept a future where she suffered alone for something she never chose. As Van remembers Ryuka's smile, the answer finally reaches him. His heartbeat pounds through his entire body, and the feeling he once dismissed as simple childhood affection becomes impossible to ignore. Van realizes that he has loved Ryuka for years. He did not understand the emotion as a child, but every promise, injury, and return to Wormhole came from the same desire to stay beside her. The companions listening to Van's confession freeze in stunned silence, before erupting with excitement. Their reaction embarrasses him, but it also confirms that his feelings were obvious to everyone except Van himself. Van releases the mana stored through 10 years of training and launches himself toward Wormhole. The pressure of his descent shakes the dungeon, announcing his arrival before the possessed Ryuka can prepare. The will of mana mocks Van's declaration as sentimental nonsense. It believes love cannot overcome the system that has controlled heroes and demon lords for generations and dismisses him as another temporary obstacle. Van answers that the entity has never truly controlled anything by its own strength. It only hides, steals blessings, and manipulates others from the shadows, proving that beneath its grand claims it is merely a parasite. Enraged by the insult, the will of mana abandons its amusement and attacks. It declares that Van's devotion to Ryuka has become tiresome, then pours her stolen power into a killing blow. A gigantic wave of mana crashes through the battlefield. The defenders brace behind ruined walls, while Van advances directly into the attack, refusing to let the possessed Ryuka move farther from him. The impact tears apart the chamber and sends monsters flying. When the dust begins to clear, the will of mana searches for Van, expecting the overwhelming blast to have erased him completely. Van steps out of the smoke with a casual greeting, still standing despite the attack. His return shocks both the enemy and the exhausted defenders, who immediately understand that the real counterattack has begun. The will of mana senses the enormous energy circulating through Van and cannot comprehend its source. 10 years of accumulated mana now surrounds him, exceeding anything the entity measured during their earlier encounters. Realizing Van cannot be crushed, alone the will of Mana decides to create allies from Ryuka's power. It summons manifestations modeled after the demon lords of the past, and orders them to overwhelm him together. The entity presents Van with another false choice: protect Ryuka's body, or save the world from the summoned demon lords. Van refuses the premise entirely, declaring that he will protect both instead of sacrificing either. Van charges into the summoned army with Ryuka's defenders behind him. Rather than retreat from the impossible numbers, the group follows his decision and commits to protecting everyone caught in the will of Mana's plan. The battlefield erupts as Van cuts through the first wave of demon lord constructs. Each strike destroys another manifestation, while the remaining monsters close around him from every direction. The will of Mana recognizes that Van's stored energy surpasses even the heroes of previous eras. Greed replaces confidence as it decides to take that power for itself and add him to the cycle it controls. The entity boasts that the earlier attack removed the last obstacle inside Ryuka and left all her mana under its command. It believes Van has lost every hope of reaching the real girl beneath the possession. Van ignores the claim and drives deeper into the storm of mana. His target is not the body standing before him, but the parasite buried within Ryuka's power and consciousness. When the will of Mana calls itself untouchable, Van grabs hold of its energy directly. Years of training his mana control to the edge of death allow him to seize the parasite without damaging Ryuka. Van's restraint shatters the moment the entity boasts about Chech hurting his childhood friend. He tears through its defense and strikes with all his strength, furious that it used Ryuka's body and feelings as weapons. Van's strike tears through the will of Mana's outer form and makes Ryuka scream. Instead of retreating, he prepares another precise technique, determined to cut away the parasite without injuring the girl trapped beneath it. The entity is stunned when Van's cutting slash erases the damaged mana completely. Power that should regenerate under its control simply disappears, proving that Van can destroy the parasite faster than it can rebuild itself. Van declares that he and Ryuka are childhood friends, and that bond is all the reason he needs to fight. His answer rejects every prophecy, title, and system the will of Mana tried to place above their relationship. The manifestations of past demon lords sense that Van can eliminate them permanently and attack together. Though the will of Mana calls him dangerous, Van charges straight into the encirclement without slowing down. A single sweeping slash cuts through the summoned army and splits the battlefield open. The will of Mana watches its strongest constructs vanish, finally understanding that Van's stored power was designed specifically to erase it. Van reaches the core of the possession and sees Ryuka's consciousness trapped inside the mass of mana. Calling her his sleeping beauty, he decides that destroying the parasite is only the first step. He must also wake Ryuka herself. Standing in the center of Wormhole, Van calls directly to Ryuka and promises to pull her back. The defenders hear his voice carry through the dungeon as he refuses to let the will of Mana speak for her any longer. Van unleashes super spinning slash, drilling through layers of hostile mana around Ryuka. The rotating blade carves a path toward her consciousness, while the parasite desperately thickens its defenses. The will of Mana reshapes its barrier into countless overlapping plates, but Van keeps cutting. Even when one layer stops his sword, he immediately changes the angle and continues toward Ryuka without wasting movement. The entity declares that Ryuka now splits and floods the chamber with a rain of magical axes. Van protects the opening he created, refusing to let the counterattack close the route to her heart. The battlefield fills with falling weapons and exploding mana. Van destroys the attack's nearest Ryuka, while the remaining defenders intercept everything aimed at his back, allowing him to concentrate on reaching her. Prominence and the other heroes arrive and join the defense. They mock the summoned demon lords as insignificant compared with Van, then divide into teams to keep the constructs away from the central fight. Old allies reunite in the middle of battle and immediately resume their familiar insults, including complaints about weight and appearance. Beneath the jokes, each warrior checks that the others survived before returning to the fight. The veterans argue over who defeated which revived demon lord and whether their old rivalry is settled. Their loud reunion distracts the enemy long enough for the younger fighters to reorganize around Van. Heroes, monsters, and adventurers launch a coordinated attack against the remaining constructs. Their combined assault clears the space around Van and prevents the Will of Mana from using its summoned army to protect itself. The entity tries to dismiss Van's attacks and feelings as useless, claiming Ryuka can no longer hear him. Van rejects the claim, certain that the affection she carried for years has not disappeared inside the possession. Van calls Ryuka's name at full volume and asks whether his voice reaches her. The shout pierces the collapsing mana around her, forcing a reaction from the consciousness hidden beneath the Will of Mana. Van admits that there is something he has wanted to tell Ryuka for a long time. The sudden confession shocks every ally listening, but he refuses to delay now that she may finally be able to hear him. He first apologizes for letting a parasite attach itself to her and control her life. Van promises to remove it completely, not because she is a demon's lord vessel, but because Ryuka never consented to any of this suffering. Van confesses that every romantic conversation with Ryuka left him struggling to hide his feelings. During all the days they spent together, keeping a straight face became harder, because he had already fallen in love with her. Van tells Ryuka that every moment beside her made him happy, from their first meeting through the 10 years that followed. What began as a childhood promise became the most important relationship in his life. Inside the possession, Ryuka remembers the companions who loved, protected, and laughed with her. Their faces remind her that the Will of Mana never owned the life she built inside Wormhole. Van finally says the words directly. He wants to stay with Ryuka from now on, make her smile, and remain beside her forever. He asks her to choose a future with him, instead of the destiny forced upon her. Every ally listening erupts at the confession, while the Will of Mana loses control of Ryuka's expression. The feelings it dismissed as weakness begin pulling her consciousness back toward Van. The entity demands to know whether Van truly means what he said. He answers without hesitation, giving Ryuka the certainty she needs to resist from inside the possessed body. Ryuka forces herself through the parasite's control and screams Van's name. Her sudden movement tears open the dark mana surrounding her, proving that her consciousness has not disappeared. When Ryuka fully surfaces, she complains that Van's confession completely overwhelmed her. Van calls her name in relief, while the others celebrate that the real Ryuka can finally answer him. Ryuka teases Van for choosing such an embarrassingly dramatic confession without giving her time to prepare. Even while blushing, she admits that hearing those words was exactly what she had been waiting for. Before they can continue, Ryuka remembers that Harpy was stabbed and confirms she is already healed completely. The interruption gives the Will of Mana another chance to attack from behind. Dark tendrils seize Ryuka and try to drag her consciousness back under control. She fights the pull while Van searches for an opening that will let him reach her without striking her body. The Will of Mana accuses Van of trying to steal Ryuka from it. Van answers that the parasite is the thief, because it attached itself to a child and used her power without consent. The entity builds a violent barrier around Ryuka and launches attacks at anyone who approaches. Van's allies clear the surrounding threats and shout for him to keep moving toward her. Van forces his way through the storm, shielding his face as the hostile mana cuts across him. Ryuka stretches toward him from inside the barrier, and both refuse to let the remaining distance grow again. Their hands nearly meet as the Will of Mana tightens its hold. Van reaches farther despite the pressure, while Ryuka throws her remaining strength into one final attempt to escape. Van catches Ryuka's hand and promises that he will bring her back completely. The contact connects their mana directly, creating the path required for the plan prepared 10 years earlier. He pulls Ryuka into his arms and holds her close while the parasite thrashes around them. Their companions stare in shock, but the embrace keeps Ryuka anchored to her own consciousness. Heroes and dungeon residents shout encouragement as Van maintains the connection. The Will of Mana screams through Ryuka's body, realizing that the stored's power is about to be released directly into its core. At the exact moment Ryuka regains control, Van pours all 10 years of accumulated mana into her. The energy enters through their joined hands and floods the parasite before it can sever the connection. The transfer erupts into a towering surge of light while everyone holds the battlefield together. Van and Ryuka endure the pressure at the center, forcing the Will of Mana out instead of allowing it to take her with it. A massive explosion sweeps across the ruined dungeon and throws the fighters away from the center. As the light fades, Van remains focused on one question: whether the plan truly separated Ryuka from the parasite. When the light clears, Ryuka falls into Van's arms in her normal form. He calls her name and waits for any response, afraid that removing the parasite may have taken her consciousness with it. Ryuka wakes and suddenly kisses Van, leaving him and every watching companion speechless. She tries to dismiss it as only a kiss, then realizes the entire crowd witnessed the moment she had imagined in private. Seeing Van cry with relief, Ryuka calls him a dummy and tells him not to waste tears now that she is safe. She thanks him for keeping his promise, while their friends erupt in celebration around them. The victory is incomplete. The expelled will of mana gathers the remaining power of the summoned demon lords and forms a gigantic body, condemning humans and monsters for repeating conflict and hatred. The parasite threatens to erase everyone down to the last atom, but Van and Ryuka stand together against it. Their friends prepare behind them as the childhood pair face the enemy that controlled their lives for 10 years. Van and Ryuka promise not to let go again. With the will of mana still ahead and countless lives left to protect, they charge into the final battle side by side, choosing their own future at last.